He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just stood in the rain and watched them tow away the only thing left of his wife. And the woman who ordered it done? She was 30 floors up, straightening her blazer for a meeting that was about to destroy everything she'd spent a decade building. And she didn't even know his name yet. This is the story of a billionaire who looked at a man and saw a truck, and a man who looked at the world and still chose to save someone who never deserved it. Hit like, drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. The rain came down in sheets over Atlanta that Tuesday morning, the kind of cold, relentless October rain that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives and refuses to leave. The kind that soaks through a jacket in 40 seconds and turns every parking lot into a shallow river. Mason Reed didn't mind it much. He'd learned, somewhere in the years after losing Claire, that weather was just weather. It didn't care about your plans, your grief, your appointments. You either dealt with it or you went back inside. Mason wasn't the type to go back inside. He guided his truck, a 2003 Chevy Silverado in what used to be called Arrival Blue, before 15 years of Georgia sun had faded it to something closer to tired gray, into the guest parking area of Sterling Horizon Group's downtown campus at 8:47 in the morning. The engine made its usual complaint when he shut it off, a low metallic shudder that rippled through the cab before settling. The dashboard crack he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years caught the pale morning light. A pine tree air freshener, completely odorless now, twisted slowly from the rearview mirror. Mason sat there for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, not moving. He did this sometimes. Just sat. Claire used to tease him about it. You're not meditating, Mason. You're just stalling. And she wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't stalling, not exactly. It was more like gathering, collecting himself before he had to walk into something. And today, he needed to be collected. He reached across to the passenger seat and picked up a manila folder, thick with paper. Legal documents, survey maps, preservation filings stamped and dated, photographs of a neighborhood that most people in this building had probably never visited. He'd spent 3 evenings at his kitchen table organizing them while his son Noah did homework nearby, occasionally looking up to ask what Mason was working on. Trying to help some people who need it, Mason had said. Do they know you're helping them? Mason had smiled at that. One of them does. He tucked the folder under his arm, grabbed his phone, and stepped out into the rain. The Sterling Horizon Group campus was the kind of place designed to make you feel small before you even walk through the door. 40 stories of glass and steel rising out of the midtown skyline, the whole building angled slightly to catch morning light in a way that some architect had clearly spent a lot of money thinking about. A fountain out front that kept running even in a rainstorm, which always struck Mason as a particular kind of arrogance. The guest entrance was flanked by 2 security booths and a set of revolving glass doors that probably cost more than his shop. He knew what he looked like walking up to it. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt. He'd ironed it the night before, which Noah had found hilarious. Dark jeans without holes in them, and work boots he'd polished twice. He didn't own a suit. He'd thought about borrowing one from his neighbor Dennis, but Dennis was 4 inches shorter and 20 pounds heavier, and the result would have been worse than the flannel. Mason was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of hands that told you immediately he worked with them for a living. Calloused palms. A scar along his right thumb from a slip with a torque wrench 3 years ago. His hair was dark and slightly too long, and the rain was doing it no favors. He looked like what he was, a mechanic from Decatur who'd driven downtown to keep an appointment he'd been asked, very specifically, not to skip. He pushed through the revolving door and walked up to the reception desk, where a young man in a slim gray suit looked up from his monitor with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to be pleasant to everyone without actually caring about any of them. "Good morning," Mason said, setting his folder on the counter. "Mason Reed. I have an 8:50 appointment with the legal department, a compliance matter." The receptionist typed something, frowned slightly, typed again. "I'm not seeing," he started. "It was confirmed yesterday," Mason said. He pulled out his phone and opened the email. Confirmation number, contact name, time. He turned the screen toward the man. "Confirmed at 2:17 p.m. by a Rachel Odom in your compliance office." The receptionist studied the screen, then looked back at his monitor with an expression that had shifted from neutral to something slightly less comfortable. "Let me just make a quick call," he said, and reached for the phone. Mason nodded and stepped back, tucking his folder back under his arm. He glanced around the lobby. It was already busy. A cluster of men in suits near the elevator bank, someone's assistant moving fast across the marble floor with a coffee carrier, and the expression of someone who hadn't slept, a security guard near the door with his arms crossed, watching Mason with the mild, reflexive suspicion that Mason had learned to recognize and ignore. He'd been in rooms like this before. Not many, but enough. The kind of rooms where the architecture itself communicated a message. You belong here only if someone says you do. Mason had decided a long time ago he didn't need architecture to tell him where he belonged. On the 30th floor, Vanessa Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office and looked out at the rain-soaked city below. She was 30 years old. She'd been running Sterling Horizon Group, her late father's company, which she'd taken over at 24 and rebuilt almost entirely from the ground up, for 6 years. In that time, she'd tripled the company's revenue, navigated 2 regulatory investigations, and turned a stagnant real estate holding firm into a development powerhouse with projects across 7 states. She had been on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle twice. She had been profiled in Forbes. She had, by most measurable definitions, done everything right. She also hadn't slept more than 5 hours in 4 days. The East Side Corridor project, the largest redevelopment undertaking Sterling Horizon had ever attempted, a $340 million overhaul of a 12-block stretch of East Atlanta, was closing its final investor round today. The meeting started at 10. 14 investors in that room, including the Callaway Group out of New York, who were bringing $80 million to the table and had flown in last night specifically for this. Everything had been moving perfectly. Everything had been moving perfectly until about 48 hours ago, when a woman named Eleanor Marsh, 81 years old, had lived in the East Side neighborhood for 53 years, had called the Sterling Horizon General Line and asked, very politely, why there were demolition notices taped to the doors of houses that people were still living in. Vanessa's executive partner, Daniel Cross, had handled the call, had told Eleanor Marsh it was a clerical error, and had flagged the issue internally as resolved pending review. Vanessa had seen the flag. She'd assumed Daniel was handling it. She was realizing this morning, with a cold feeling she didn't want to examine too closely, that she'd been assuming a lot of things about Daniel lately. Her phone buzzed. Her assistant, Priya, Callaway delegation arriving at 9:30, conference room prepped, catering confirmed. Vanessa typed back, "Good. Make sure the overflow parking on level 2 is cleared. I don't want the Callaway people circling." She was already moving to her desk when something outside the window caught her eye. 3 floors below, visible through the rain from her angle, the guest lot adjacent to the executive entrance held one vehicle that did not belong there, a faded blue pickup truck, old, battered, parked in a space clearly marked for corporate guests and visitor validation. Vanessa stopped. She didn't know who it belonged to. It hadn't been there 20 minutes ago, and in 4 hours, that lot would be full of luxury sedans and hired cars carrying people whose first impression of Sterling Horizon began the moment they pulled off the street. She pressed her intercom. "Priya, whose truck is parked in the executive guest lot?" "The old blue one." A pause. "I'm not sure. I can check." "Have security deal with it," Vanessa said. "It needs to be moved before 9:30. Another pause, slightly longer. "Have it towed?" "If it needs to be, yes. I don't want it there when the Callaway Group arrives." She released the intercom and turned back to her desk. She had 14 investors to prepare for and a $340 million deal to close. She did not think about the truck again. Down in the lobby, the receptionist had just gotten off his call looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Sir," he said to Mason, "I'm showing that your appointment was actually canceled this morning. The contact in compliance has you listed as..." "Canceled," Mason repeated. He said it flat, not a question. "Yes, sir, about..." The receptionist checked his screen. 40 minutes ago. Mason was quiet for a moment. 40 minutes ago, he'd been pulling off I-20 onto Moreland Avenue. He'd been in the truck, not checking his phone, because he was driving. "I didn't receive a cancellation notice," he said. "I understand, sir, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "I'm not here for a routine meeting," Mason said. He kept his voice level, but he put the folder on the counter and opened it, turning several pages so the receptionist could see them. "I have documents that relate to an active development project. Legal compliance documents. There are families who could lose their homes in the next 72 hours if someone in this building doesn't look at these today. so I'd appreciate if someone could tell me who I need to speak to. The receptionist looked at the documents. He looked at Mason. He looked at the documents again. He was 23 years old and 3 months into his job and completely unequipped for this. Let me get the security supervisor, he said. He made another call. While he waited, Mason reorganized the pages in his folder and tried to figure out who had canceled his appointment and when and why, because it seemed deeply important to know whether that was an accident or something else entirely. He had a bad feeling it wasn't an accident. The security supervisor's name was Greg Tomlin, and he arrived at the desk with the energy of a man who'd already handled 4 problems this morning and wasn't excited about a 5th. He was broad-shouldered, 50-ish, with a silver crew cut and the slightly weary authority of someone who'd spent years working crowd control before landing a corporate security job. "Mr. Reed," he said. "Yeah," Mason said. "I understand you've got an appointment issue." "My appointment was canceled without my knowledge," Mason said. "I drove 40 minutes to be here. I have documents I need to deliver to your compliance team today, not next week." Greg looked at the folder, then at Mason, doing the same quiet assessment that people always did when they met Mason, registering the clothes, the hands, the truck outside, running some internal calculation. "What's the nature of the documents?" Greg asked. "Property survey discrepancies and preservation filing records related to the East Side Corridor project," Mason said. "There are occupied homes on the demolition schedule that shouldn't be there. I have the filings to prove it." Greg's expression shifted slightly. Something tightened around his eyes. "Wait here," he said, and pulled out his radio. That was the moment Vanessa's call came through. Mason watched Greg's face change as he listened to his earpiece. The supervisor's jaw moved slightly, a small compression of something. Disagreement, maybe, or the particular kind of discomfort that comes from being asked to do something you know is wrong by someone who signs your checks. Greg clicked his radio. "Copy that." He looked at Mason. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you to move your vehicle." Mason frowned. "Move it where?" "Off the property. There's a—" Greg paused, choosing his words. "There's a concern about the parking situation in the executive lot." "I'm in the guest lot," Mason said. "The sign says guest parking." "Sir, is this about the truck?" Mason asked quietly. "Someone looked out a window and decided my truck doesn't belong here?" Greg had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I've been asked to have it towed if it's not moved in the next—" "I'll move it," Mason said. "I just need someone to tell me where I should park so I can come back inside and deliver these documents." "There's a public garage 2 blocks east on—" Mason's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. "Unknown number, local Atlanta area code." He answered it. "Is this Mason Reed, owner of a 2003 Silverado, plate number GHT 4492? "Yeah," Mason said slowly. "This is Falcon Towing. We've been dispatched to your vehicle at Sterling Horizon Group. Just calling to let you know we're on site." Mason turned around and walked fast toward the revolving door. He pushed through it into the rain just in time to see the back end of his truck rising off the ground. "Hey!" He was already moving, already cutting across the wet asphalt. "Hey, stop! That's my truck!" The tow truck operator, a young guy with a rain slicker and the look of someone who'd been dispatched and was just doing the job, raised his hand slightly. "Sir, we were called by property management. I have a guest appointment here. I was inside following up on a clerical issue." Mason got to his truck and put his hand on the tailgate, which was now 2 feet off the ground. "Put it down!" "Sir, I've got a dispatch order from—" "Put it down." His voice didn't crack. It didn't rise into a shout. It went the other direction, quieter, actually, and harder, and the tow operator stopped talking and looked at him with a new kind of attention. Greg Tomlin had followed Mason outside and was now standing a few feet back watching. "Greg," Mason said, not looking away from the truck, "you know this is wrong. You know I have a legitimate appointment with your compliance team, and you know someone upstairs saw a truck they didn't like and made a call without asking a single question." Greg was quiet. "I'm asking you, as one person to another, to tell that driver to put my truck down." A long moment, rain drumming on the tow truck's cab, water running down the back of Mason's neck. Greg keyed his radio, said something quietly. The tow operator looked at his phone, shrugged, started lowering the truck. And then Greg's radio crackled again, louder this time, a woman's voice, sharp, clipped, clearly not interested in debate. "Mr. Tomlin, I said have it removed. Do I need to clarify the directive?" Greg's face went still. He pressed the radio again. Understood, ma'am. He looked at Mason. Something in his expression said, I'm sorry. I genuinely am, and I can't help you. Sir, he said quietly, you need to step back from the vehicle. Mason looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. He stood on the wet asphalt in the rain, and he watched them take his truck. He watched the chains go taut, and the frame lift, and the tires leave the ground. He watched the old Silverado swing gently as the tow truck maneuvered toward the exit, the worn blue paint catching the gray morning light. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He stood there with a manila folder full of documents tucked under his arm, getting soaked, watching the last piece of a life he'd built with the woman he loved get dragged around a corner and disappear. And then he turned around and walked back into the building. Because he still had a job to do. The lobby felt different when he came back through the revolving door, or maybe he felt different, moving through it. The security guard near the entrance tracked him. The receptionist looked up with an expression caught somewhere between pity and relief that someone else would have to deal with this. Mason walked back to the desk. He set the folder down again. He pulled out his phone, found the confirmation email, and turned the screen around one more time. I need to speak to someone in compliance, he said. The name on my confirmation is Rachel Odom. I need her office number, her extension, or someone who can physically walk me to her desk. I've driven 40 minutes. My appointment was canceled without notification, and my vehicle was just towed from your guest lot while I was actively trying to check in. I'm not leaving until someone looks at these documents. The receptionist looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. That was when a woman in a navy blazer stepped up beside Mason and said, I'll take him. Her name was Olivia Hart. She was 38, with dark natural hair pulled back and reading glasses she didn't currently need hanging from her collar. She was Sterling Horizon's Director of Regulatory Compliance, and she had been crossing the lobby toward the coffee station when she heard the tail end of Mason's exchange with the front desk, specifically the phrase occupied homes on the demolition schedule. Those 7 words had stopped her cold, because Olivia had been asking questions about the East Side Corridor project for 3 weeks. Quiet questions, carefully worded, routed through internal channels in ways that wouldn't immediately raise flags. She had not been getting satisfying answers. She'd been on her way to her 8:50 meeting, the one her calendar confirmed, the one she'd scheduled after receiving a call from a Rachel Odom in her own department, telling her a Mr. Mason Reed had important documentation regarding the East Side project and needed to meet with someone that morning, when the meeting had disappeared off her calendar. Just vanished 45 minutes ago. No cancellation notice, no reschedule request. Just gone, as if it had never been confirmed. Olivia had thought, that's odd. Now she thought, that is not an accident. I'll take him, she said again, showing her badge to the receptionist. She turned to Mason. Olivia Hart, Regulatory Compliance. You've got documents about the East Side project? Mason looked at her. He was soaked. His shirt was darkening at the shoulders and his hair was flattened and there was water running down the side of his face that he hadn't bothered to wipe away. And he was watching her with the careful attention of someone who'd already been let down twice this morning and wasn't sure whether the third time was going to be different. Yeah, he said. Come with me. She took him to a small conference room on the 4th floor, a working room with no view, and a whiteboard covered in someone's old meeting notes. She closed the door, offered him a chair, and said, Give me 2 minutes, while she made a phone call in the corner of the room, her voice low. Mason sat down. He opened the folder on the table. He arranged the documents in the order he'd planned. Survey maps first, then the preservation filings, then the photographs, then the ownership records that Eleanor Marsh had given him 3 days ago, with hands that shook slightly from age, but not from uncertainty. These are real, Eleanor had told him, sitting at her kitchen table on Donnelly Avenue. I've kept every paper since 1971. Nobody's ever asked to see them before. Olivia came back to the table and sat across from him. She had a legal pad and a pen. She looked at the documents he'd spread out, and then she looked at him, and her expression had changed from the alert professional neutrality she'd arrived with to something that was starting to resemble controlled alarm. Okay, she said, tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Mason did. He told her about Eleanor Marsh, who'd called his shop 3 weeks ago, because her nephew had mentioned Mason was good at figuring out problems, and Eleanor had a problem that felt too big for her to handle alone. He told her about driving over to Donnelly Avenue on a Saturday morning and sitting in Eleanor's kitchen for 3 hours, going through 50 years of documents spread across her dining room table. Eleanor's house was on a block that had been in the East Side Corridor redevelopment map for 6 months. It was listed, along with 14 other properties on the same street, as unoccupied residential, eligible for acquisition and demolition. The problem was that 11 of those 15 properties were currently occupied. People lived in them, had been living in them, some of them, for decades. The bigger problem was the community center at the end of the block, the East Side Heritage House, built in 1962. Listed on the Georgia Historic Register in 2009, which meant it was federally protected and could not be demolished without a full preservation review process, public notice, and approval from the State Historic Preservation Office, a process that took, at minimum, 6 months. Sterling Horizon's current demolition schedule had the Heritage House coming down in 19 days. They filed for the SHPO review? Olivia asked, pen moving fast. That's the thing, Mason said. He slid a document across the table. They filed it. It's time-stamped. It's in the system. But look at the address. Olivia looked. Her pen stopped. The Preservation Review filing for East Side Heritage House, 441, 2 Donnelly Avenue, had been submitted to the SHPO with a minor but critical error. The address was logged as 4412, Donnelly Avenue West, a street that did not exist. The system had flagged it as a data entry anomaly, automatically routed it to a pending review queue, and there it had sat for 61 days. Quote, technically filed, functionally invisible. That could be an honest mistake, Olivia said carefully. It could be, Mason agreed. Except, he pulled another document. There's a correction request in the system. Submitted 18 days ago. Someone in your company's development office noticed the error and submitted a correction request to bring the address in line with the actual property. Olivia looked at the document. And the correction was denied. Rejected at the executive level, Mason said quietly. With a notation, filing addresses under review, action deferred pending project assessment, signed. He turned the page so she could see the signature line. Olivia read the name. She set her pen down. For a moment, she was completely still. Daniel Cross, she said. That's the signature, yeah, Mason said. Olivia was quiet for 10 seconds. Mason watched her think, watched her turn something over, examining it from different angles, looking for the interpretation she could live with before arriving at the one she couldn't avoid. How did you get this? She asked. Eleanor Marsh filed a records request 6 weeks ago. She's been requesting public documents related to the project through the city's open records process. That correction request came back in her last batch. Mason paused. She's 81 years old and she's been doing this herself because she didn't know who else to ask. Olivia closed her eyes briefly. Then her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Call from D. Cross. She stared at the screen for 2 full rings before pressing ignore. Okay, she said. She stood up. Okay. I need you to stay here. Don't go anywhere. I need to make some copies of these, and I need to make some calls, and I need to do both of those things in the next, she checked her watch, 40 minutes, before a very large investor meeting begins on the 29th floor. What are you going to do? Mason asked. Olivia looked at him across the table. My job, she said, which apparently someone's been hoping I wouldn't. She was already at the door when Mason's phone rang. He looked at the screen. The towing company. He answered it. Mr. Reed, this is Falcon Towing Dispatch. We need to let you know there was an incident during transport of your vehicle. The driver clipped a concrete barrier at the I-20 ramp on entry. There's significant damage to the front left panel, and Mason stopped hearing the specific words at some point. He heard the tone of them, apologetic, legal disclaimer-ish, the voice of someone reading from a script designed to manage liability. And he sat there in the small, windowless conference room with the phone against his ear and looked at the wall. Olivia had paused in the doorway when she heard him go quiet. She watched his face. Mason's expression didn't collapse. That was the thing. It didn't collapse. His jaw tightened slightly, and he blinked once, slowly, and he breathed in through his nose. That was all. When the towing company finished its prepared statement, Mason said, Okay, I'll need the full damage report in writing. Can you email that to me? He gave them his address, confirmed the impound location, and hung up. Olivia was still in the doorway. Truck, she said quietly. Damage during tow. He paused. Front panel? Probably the frame alignment. Maybe more. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. You could hear it, plain and direct, not the hollow kind. Mason nodded once. He looked at the document still spread on the table in front of him. That truck was my wife's, he said. Not dramatically, just as a fact, offered plainly, the way you offer something true. She passed away 4 years ago. My son was 6. We drove that truck home from the hospital the day he was born. He paused. I know it looks like what it is, an old truck with 200,000 miles on it. But he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Olivia stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. Then she said, I'll be back in 30 minutes, and left. Yes, Mason sat alone in the conference room. He thought about Noah this morning, 10 years old now, eating cereal at the kitchen table, telling Mason very seriously that he'd read online that the record for eating a bowl of cereal was 11 seconds and he was planning to break it. Mason had told him that was unsanitary. Noah had said that was the point. They'd argued good-naturedly about it for 5 minutes, and Mason had been running late because of it and hadn't minded at all. He thought about Claire, who had named the truck. She'd done that. Named inanimate objects. The truck was Gerald. Their kitchen table was referred to as the Parliament. The ancient washing machine that had finally died 2 years ago had been called Margaret, and when it stopped working, Claire had stood in the laundry room looking at it for a long moment before saying, very solemnly, Margaret, you served honorably. He thought about the green notebook in the glove compartment. He'd put it there after Claire passed because the glove compartment was where the truck kept its important documents, and the notebook was important. It was full of her handwriting. Notes about the truck, about trips they'd taken, about Noah, about small things she'd noticed and wanted to remember. She'd kept it in her purse, and then he'd found it after she was gone, and he didn't know what to do with it, so he put it in the truck, because the truck was the safest place he had. He hoped the notebook was still there. He sat in the conference room and waited, and outside the rain kept coming down. Olivia moved fast. She went to her office first, locked the door, and made 3 phone calls in 17 minutes. The first was to Rachel Odom, who confirmed that yes, she had scheduled Mason's appointment, and yes, it had appeared canceled on her end at 8:02 a.m. with an authorization code that pointed back to Daniel Cross's assistant. The second was to a city planning contact who confirmed, off the record, that the SHPO, filing for 4412 Donnelly Avenue, was still sitting in the error queue and had not been resolved. The third was to the company's general counsel, whose assistant told her the counsel was currently in a pre-meeting briefing on the 29th floor. Olivia made copies of Mason's key documents on the 4th floor copier. She put them in a new folder. She wrote 3 names on the outside of the folder in marker: Calloway, Simmons, Park. The 3 lead investors in the room upstairs. Then she went to find Vanessa Sterling. She found her in the hallway outside the 29th floor conference room 7 minutes before the investor meeting was scheduled to begin. Vanessa was standing with Daniel Cross and 2 others, talking in the low-focused way of people running final checks before something big. She was in a charcoal blazer, her dark hair back and clean, and she had the kind of composed precision about her that came from knowing exactly what she was doing. She did not look like someone who was aware that anything was wrong. Vanessa, Olivia said, I need 2 minutes. Vanessa looked at her. Something in Olivia's expression, she was good at reading faces, she'd built a career on it, caught her attention. What is it? Not here, Olivia said. She glanced at Daniel. Daniel was 43, silver-templed, and smooth, with the relaxed confidence of someone who'd navigated corporate politics long enough to feel permanently settled in his position. He watched Olivia with a small, measured smile. Olivia, always with the last-minute fires. Yep, Olivia said. She kept her eyes on Vanessa. 2 minutes. Vanessa stepped aside with her into a small alcove. Olivia gave her the condensed version. The occupied homes on the demolition list. The Heritage House preservation filing with the wrong address. The correction request that Daniel had suppressed. The man downstairs with the documentation to prove all of it, whose appointment had been canceled without notification and whose truck had been towed from the guest lot this morning on Vanessa's order. Vanessa was very still during all of this. Her face didn't do much. That was the thing about people who ran large organizations. They learned to keep their faces from doing things in the middle of receiving information because you needed to hear all of it before you reacted to any of it. When Olivia finished, Vanessa said, "How confident are you in the source?" "I spent 30 minutes going through the documentation," Olivia said. "It's solid. The SHPO filing error is real, the suppression notation is real, and a man named Mason Reed has been sitting in a fourth-floor conference room for the last 40 minutes in wet clothes because he drove here specifically to make sure someone saw it before the demolition crews got called." A beat of silence. "Show me," Vanessa said. "The meeting? Show me the documents first." Olivia handed her the folder. Vanessa opened it. She looked at the survey maps, the preservation filing, the correction request with Daniel's name at the bottom. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at the conference room door, behind which 14 investors were currently settling in with coffee and binders full of projections for a project that was, as of this moment, potentially weeks away from making national news for all the wrong reasons. She closed the folder. "Okay," she said. What happened next happened fast. Vanessa walked back into the hallway and told Daniel she needed a 10-minute delay on the meeting start. Daniel said, with his usual practiced calm, that the Callaway delegation was already seated and a delay would send the wrong signal. "Daniel," Vanessa said, "I need 10 minutes." Something shifted in his expression then. Subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. A recalculation. A reassessment of how much she knew and what that meant. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I'll let them know." Vanessa turned to her assistant, Priya. "Bring the man from the fourth-floor conference room up here. His name is Mason Reed." Priya blinked. "Right now?" "Right now." She walked into the conference room and Olivia followed, and Daniel, after a moment's hesitation, followed too. The Callaway lead, James Callaway, 62, Houston money, the kind of man who'd been in enough rooms like this to know immediately when something had changed, looked up from his water glass. "Vanessa," he said pleasantly. "Small delay?" "Brief one," she said. She sat at the head of the table. She put Olivia's folder in front of her. She kept her hands flat on the table and looked at the room with the steady expression of someone who has made a decision and is no longer uncertain about it. "There's something you all need to see before we begin." Mason walked into that room 5 minutes later, still in his wet flannel shirt, folder under his arm, with Priya leading him through the door like she wasn't entirely sure this was a good idea. He stopped in the doorway and took in the room. Long conference table, 14 people, floor-to-ceiling windows behind them all looking out at the rain, and at the head of the table a woman he hadn't met yet, in a charcoal blazer, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Reed," the woman said, "I'm Vanessa Sterling. I understand you've been trying to get these documents to my compliance team since yesterday." "Since last week, actually," Mason said. A beat. "Please sit down," she said. He did. And then Daniel Cross, still standing near the wall, spoke up with the smooth control of someone who's losing ground and knows it and won't let it show. "Vanessa, with respect, I think we should be careful about—" He paused, and for just a moment there was a slight shift in his tone, something that couldn't quite decide whether to be dismissive or threatening, bringing in outside parties who may not fully understand the complexity of a project of this scale. "This gentleman is a—" He glanced at Mason. "Mechanic. He's working from documents provided by a local resident who may not have full context for how large-scale redevelopment operates." The room was quiet. Mason looked at Daniel Cross. Then he looked back at the folder, opened it, and placed the correction request. The one with Daniel's name and authorization code at the bottom, in the center of the table. "A man doesn't need expensive clothes," Mason said quietly, "to recognize when families are about to lose their homes." Nobody said anything for a moment. James Callaway reached across the table and picked up the document. He read it. He set it down and picked up the survey map. He looked at that for a long time. Then he looked up at Vanessa with an expression that had moved well past pleasant. "How long?" he said, Has your company known about this? Vanessa didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the correction request, at Daniel's signature, at the timestamp, 18 days ago, and thinking about 18 days of conversations with Daniel about the East Side project, 18 days of reports and updates and projections, 18 days of being told everything was moving forward cleanly and on schedule. She thought about Eleanor Marsh calling the general line and being told it was a clerical error. She thought about a truck being towed from the guest lot because she'd looked out a window and made a judgment in 30 seconds without asking a single question. She thought about the man sitting 2 chairs down from her in a wet flannel shirt who had driven 40 minutes to keep an appointment that someone on her own team had deleted. "We're going to take a short break," she said. Her voice was steady. 20 minutes. And when we come back, I'm going to answer your question honestly, Mr. Calloway. Every part of it. She stood up. She looked at Mason. "Mr. Reed, could you stay?" Mason nodded. Daniel Cross started to say something. Vanessa turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop. The rain kept hitting the windows, 30 stories up, over a city where 11 families were still waking up in homes that were on a demolition schedule nobody had told them about. Where an 81-year-old woman named Eleanor Marsh was probably sitting in her kitchen right now waiting for a phone call, having trusted a mechanic from Decatur with 50 years of careful, quiet record-keeping. And in a 4th-floor conference room where an old green notebook sat in a damaged truck at an impound lot on the south side of the city, full of handwriting that nobody could replace. The morning wasn't over yet, but something had shifted, quietly, irreversibly, in the way the day was going to end. The 20-minute break Vanessa had called lasted 11. Not because everything was resolved, nothing was resolved, but because James Calloway walked back into the conference room after 9 minutes, set his coffee down, and said, "I've made some calls," in the tone of a man who didn't need to elaborate on who he'd called or what they'd said. The other investors filtered back in behind him. Some of them had been on their phones in the hallway. A few had been talking to each other in the low, clipped way that people talk when they're recalibrating and don't want to be overheard doing it. Mason was still in the room. He'd moved to a chair along the wall while the investors were out, giving the table back to the people who were supposed to be sitting at it, and he'd spent the 11 minutes going through his folder one more time, making sure everything was in the order he wanted, making sure he hadn't missed anything. It was what he did when he was nervous, checked his work, rechecked it. It drove Claire crazy when he did it at home. The oil's already changed, Mason. You don't need to verify it 3 times. He'd told her once that he verified things because he cared about getting them right. She'd looked at him with that particular expression she had and said, "I know. That's not why it drives me crazy." He still didn't entirely know what she'd meant by that. He'd never gotten around to asking. Vanessa took her seat at the head of the table. Daniel Cross was still in the room, which surprised Mason slightly. He'd half expected the man to disappear during the break, or at least try to. But Daniel was still there, standing near the far end of the table with his arms loose at his sides and his expression professionally neutral, the way an attorney looks during testimony they're not worried about, like a man who had already decided on his strategy and was comfortable with it. "Before we go any further," Vanessa said, "I want to address the question Mr. Calloway asked before the break." She looked around the room. "How long has Sterling Horizon known about this issue?" She paused just long enough to make it clear she'd thought about how to answer. "I personally became aware of it 45 minutes ago," she said. "That is the honest answer to the question. I became aware of it when our Director of Regulatory Compliance walked a set of documents into my hands 7 minutes before this meeting was scheduled to begin." Another pause. "I was not, until that moment, aware that there were occupied homes on our demolition schedule, or that our SHPO preservation filing for the Heritage House contained an address error, or that a correction to that error had been submitted and subsequently suppressed at the executive level." The room was quiet. James Calloway looked at her steadily. "And who suppressed it?" Vanessa didn't look at Daniel. She kept her eyes on Calloway. "That's what we're going to establish clearly and on the record over the next hour. What I can tell you right now is that I have the document in front of me and I can see the authorization signature." "I'd like to see that document," Calloway said. "It's already in front of you," Olivia said from across the table, where she'd quietly slid a copy toward him during Vanessa's pause. Calloway picked it up. Read it. passed it to the woman on his left, Patricia Simmons, who ran a Chicago development fund and had been mostly quiet all morning with the watchful stillness of someone collecting data. She read it. Her expression didn't change much, but something around her eyes tightened slightly. Daniel spoke from the end of the table. "I want to be clear about the context of that document," he said. His voice was measured, the careful tempo of someone who'd prepared for this possibility. The correction request was flagged because the filing process itself was under an internal review. There were concerns about the broader accuracy of the property survey data, and the decision to defer was made to avoid compounding an error with an incomplete correction. It was a procedural judgment call, not a suppression. The word hung in the room. Mason, from his chair along the wall, was watching Daniel the way he watched an engine he didn't trust, quietly, cataloging sounds, waiting for the one that confirmed what he already suspected. "Procedural," Calloway repeated, flat. "In the context of an active review, yes, Mr. Cross." Calloway set the document down. He was 62 years old and had built 4 major development funds from the ground up, and he did not raise his voice, but there was a quality to his stillness that made the room feel smaller. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer. On the date this correction request was submitted, the date on that document, were you aware that the address error in the SHPO filing meant the Heritage House was not legally protected under the preservation review process?" A fraction of a second's pause. Not long, just long enough. "I was aware there was an ongoing question about—" "Were you aware," Calloway said again, "that without a valid SHPO filing, your company's demolition schedule for a federally registered historic property was proceeding without legal clearance?" The silence this time was different, thicker. Daniel's expression held, but his right hand, resting on the table, moved slightly, the index finger pulling back just a millimeter, just enough. Mason noticed it. He didn't think many other people in the room did. "I was aware," Daniel said, "that there were complexities in the filing status that required—" "That's a yes," Calloway said simply, and looked away from Daniel toward Vanessa. What followed over the next 40 minutes was not a meeting so much as a controlled dismantling. Calloway asked questions. Simmons asked questions. A man named Howard Park, who represented a Korean infrastructure investment group and had barely spoken all morning, asked 4 questions in a row that were so precise and so specific they made it clear he'd been running numbers in his head during the break and had arrived at conclusions he was now confirming. Vanessa answered what she could honestly, acknowledged what she didn't know, and twice said plainly, "I can't give you an accurate answer to that yet because I don't have complete information," which was not what any investor wanted to hear, but which was, apparently, more reassuring than the alternative, because it matched what the document showed, and it matched what Mason had said, and it was internally consistent in a way that Daniel's answers, by contrast, increasingly were not. Mason was asked to speak twice. Both times he kept it short and factual. He described how Eleanor Marsh had contacted him, what she'd provided, what the record showed. He used the word discrepancy rather than fraud, and the phrase appears inconsistent with rather than proves because he was not a lawyer, and he was careful about the difference. Both times he finished, Olivia added a note or confirmed a document reference, and the investors asked follow-up questions of her rather than him, which was appropriate. She was the professional with access to the full picture. But twice Calloway glanced over at Mason with an expression that was something between measuring and recalculating. At one point, about 25 minutes in, Daniel made another attempt to reframe the occupied homes issue as a data management problem. Legacy survey data, third-party GIS, contractor errors, these things happen in projects of this scale. And Mason, who had been quiet for several minutes, said from his chair along the wall, "There are people living in those houses right now. Whatever the data says, the houses aren't empty. You can go stand on Donnelly Avenue and knock on any door, and a person will answer it. Jars." It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was just the kind of specific, unarguable fact that made the reframing collapse under its own weight. Daniel looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, the professional neutrality slipped and something colder showed through. It was the look of a man who was accustomed to being the smartest tactician in any given room and had just registered that someone he'd completely discounted was causing him real problems. Mason met his eyes and didn't look away. Then Daniel looked back at the investors, and the neutral expression was back in place, and he said something about engaging directly with the affected residents, and the moment passed. But Vanessa had seen it. The meeting wrapped without a formal resolution on the Callaway investment, which was, Vanessa understood, the best possible outcome available to her under the circumstances. Callaway did not pull out. He also did not confirm. He said, before leaving, "We appreciate the transparency, Vanessa. That's noted. We'll want a revised project assessment within 10 business days that addresses the compliance issues directly, along with a clear remediation plan." He paused at the door. "And whatever action you're taking internally on the authorization issue, I'd recommend documenting it thoroughly." He left without looking at Daniel. The other investors filed out. Most of them were on their phones before they reached the hallway. Mason could hear the murmur of conversations going quiet as doors closed. When the room had emptied down to Vanessa, Olivia, Daniel, and Mason, it was very quiet for a moment. Daniel spoke first. "Vanessa," he said, "whatever you're thinking right now, I want you to slow down. We have options here. This can be managed. The documentation—" "Daniel," Vanessa said, "has significant contextual gaps that—" "Daniel." Her voice didn't rise. It went quieter, which was worse. "I need you to go to your office and stay there. Don't talk to anyone from legal. Don't communicate with anyone on the development team. Don't send any emails. I need your access badge, and I need it now." A long pause. "You're not serious," he said. "Your badge," she said. Something moved across his face. Surprise, maybe. Or the specific variety of anger that comes from being stripped of something you believed was permanent. He held it for a couple seconds. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled the badge from his inside pocket, and set it on the table with more force than necessary. "You're going to regret this," he said. Not a threat, exactly. More like a weather forecast. "Maybe," Vanessa said. "Badge is on the table. Go to your office." He left. The door didn't slam. He wasn't the kind of man who slammed doors. That was somehow worse. After Daniel left, the room got very quiet in a different way. The kind of quiet that settles after something loud has passed, even when nothing loud actually happened. Olivia sat down. Vanessa stayed standing for a moment, one hand on the back of her chair, looking at the conference table covered in documents and water glass rings, and the small physical wreckage of a meeting that had turned into something else entirely. Mason was still in his chair along the wall. "Mr. Reed," Vanessa said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't need to—" "I gave the order to have your truck towed," she said. "I looked out my window, I saw a vehicle I decided didn't belong there, and I gave the order without asking a single question. I didn't check the visitor log. I didn't ask security who it belonged to. I just—" She stopped. "I made a decision about what I was looking at before I knew anything about it." Mason was quiet for a moment. "How'd that work out?" he asked. It wasn't mean. The way he said it, it wasn't a shot. It was just a question. Slightly dry, slightly honest, the way someone talks when they're too tired for performance. Olivia made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Vanessa looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not collapsing, but loosening slightly, like a grip releasing by a few degrees. "Not great," she said. "No," Mason agreed. It didn't. He stood up, picked up his folder, and looked at Vanessa. "I appreciate you letting me in the room. What happens now with the project? That's your call and theirs." He nodded toward the door where the investors had gone. "The important thing is that Donnelly Avenue stays standing long enough for someone to sort the survey records out properly. That's all Eleanor was asking for." "Eleanor Marsh?" Vanessa said. "Has she been notified?" "I'll call her on my way to the impound lot," Mason said. "She's been waiting since this morning." Vanessa said, "I can have someone drive you to the—" "I'll get a cab," Mason said. "I'm fine." He said it without any particular edge, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd said it with one. He picked up his jacket, which was still wet, and walked to the door. He was almost through it when Vanessa said, "Mr. Reed." He turned. "I'm sorry about the truck," she said. "The damage? Whatever the tow company is responsible for, I'll make sure Sterling Horizon covers it, whatever the cost." Mason nodded once. I appreciate that. He paused. It's not really about the cost, though. He left. The Falcon Towing impound lot was on a stretch of industrial road south of I-20, the kind of place that looked like it had been dropped there by accident and nobody had bothered to move it since. Chain link fence, a small plywood-walled office with a space heater visible through the window, and 3 rows of impounded vehicles in various states of distress, arranged with the casual disorder of things that have been dragged here and left to figure it out. Mason's truck was in the second row. He saw it before he was through the gate, and he slowed slightly, the way you slow when you're preparing yourself for something. The tow operator hadn't been exaggerating on the phone. The front left panel was crumpled into the wheel well, not catastrophically, but significantly, the kind of damage that meant the alignment was gone and probably the frame was affected. The left headlight housing was cracked. There was a new scrape along the driver's side door that hadn't existed this morning. The truck sat crooked, leaning slightly to the left as if it was tired. Mason stood in front of it for a minute. The impound lot manager, a wide man named Terry, with a clipboard and the air of someone perpetually waiting for the next problem, came out of the plywood office and watched him. That's the one from this morning, Mason said, not looking away from the truck. Yeah, Terry said. Listen, our driver already filed the incident report. I know. I got the call. Mason walked to the driver's side and tried the handle. Unlocked. He opened the door. It protested, a grinding metallic sound it hadn't made this morning, and leaned in. The green notebook was in the glove compartment. He exhaled. He'd been holding something in his chest since the phone call, something he hadn't let himself examine too closely, and when he saw the notebook sitting there, small, soft-covered, slightly worn at the corners, he felt it release. He took it out and held it for a moment without opening it, then put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and turned around. Terry was still watching him. You need the report for insurance? Terry asked. Yeah, Mason looked back at the truck. I'm going to need to have her towed to my shop. Your shop? I'm a mechanic, Mason said. I've got a bay open. Terry looked at the crumpled panel and the broken headlight. That's a lot of work, he said, not unkindly, just accurately. I know what it is, Mason said. Bob. He called Eleanor Marsh from the impound lot parking lot, standing in the thin October sun that had broken through the clouds while he was inside. Too late to do much good. She answered on the second ring. Mason. Her voice was even, but he could hear the effort it cost her to keep it that way. It's okay, he said. They saw the documents. The right people saw them. A breath on the other end, long, slow. The Heritage House, she said, still standing, and now there are 14 investors who know about the SHPO issue, which means the company can't move forward on the demolition without it becoming a very public problem. The legal wheels are going to take time, but we bought time, Eleanor said. Yeah, we bought time. A pause. He could hear something faint in the background. Her television, probably, or the radio she kept on in the kitchen. She told him she kept the radio on because the house was too quiet otherwise, and after 53 years in the same place, you got used to a certain amount of noise. Your truck, she said suddenly. The one you drove here in. That old blue one. Mason frowned slightly. How do you know about... I saw you park it from my window the day you came over. It's a good truck. You can tell by how someone parks. You parked careful. She paused. Is it all right? Mason looked at it through the chain-link fence. It will be, he said. Good, Eleanor said firmly, as if she was settling the matter. Come have coffee sometime. Bring your boy. I will, Mason said. I will, Eleanor. He hung up and stood in the parking lot for a while with his face in the sun, eyes closed. Back at the shop, Noah was already home from school when Mason got in that evening. His neighbor Sandra had picked him up, the standing arrangement for days when Mason couldn't make the 3:30 bell. Noah was at the workbench near the back of the garage, technically doing homework and actually doing whatever he did on his phone that he claimed was homework, and he looked up when Mason came in with the particular expression kids wear when they've been waiting and don't want to admit they were worried. Where's the truck? Noah said. Mason explained in the abbreviated version he'd been constructing on the ride home what had happened. He left out most of the conference room part because it wasn't what mattered to the conversation, He told Noah the truck had been towed by mistake and damaged and was at an impound lot and he was going to pick it up tomorrow and fix it himself. Noah was quiet for a moment, processing. How bad? He asked. Front panel and some framework. Maybe 3 or 4 weeks? Can I help? Mason looked at him. 10 years old, still at the age where helping in the shop meant handing him tools and mostly staying out of the way, but trying hard, always trying hard, with the focused seriousness he'd had since he was very small. Yeah, Mason said. You can help. Noah nodded like this was decided. Then he looked back at his phone with the elaborate casualness of someone who had definitely not been worried. Mason went to the office at the back of the shop, a small room that was more of a closet with a desk shoved into it, and sat down. He pulled the green notebook from his jacket pocket and set it on the desk in front of him. He didn't open it, he just looked at it. It was a habit he'd developed without deciding to, keeping the notebook close but not reading it often, not because he couldn't bear to, but because he'd learned that you had to be careful about how you used the things you couldn't replace. You used them intentionally. You didn't burn through them. He'd have to tell Noah the full story eventually, not tonight, but eventually. Noah was old enough to understand more of it than Mason gave him credit for, and he had a right to know that the truck they were going to spend 3 or 4 weekends rebuilding was more than a vehicle, that it had a history, that some things were worth fixing, not because fixing them was practical, but because some things had earned the right to be whole again. Mason put the notebook back in his jacket. He sat in the small office for a while, listening to Noah moving around the garage, the sound of a stool scraping, something being set down, the particular restless motion of a 10-year-old trying to stay still, and let himself be tired for a few minutes before he had to be anything else. The next morning, Vanessa Sterling arrived at her office at 6:45. She did this every morning, the early hour a habit from the first years of running the company, when there never seemed to be enough time, and she'd discovered that the hour before anyone else arrived was the only one that belonged entirely to her. She made her own coffee in the small kitchen adjacent to her office and sat at her desk and read through whatever she needed to read before the day started pulling her in 12 directions. This morning, she sat at her desk and looked at the documents Olivia had compiled the night before. Olivia had worked until 10 p.m. She'd sent Vanessa a 30-page summary at 10:17, flagged urgent, with a cover note that said simply, "This is bigger than the SHPO filing. The more I look at it, the bigger it gets." Vanessa had read it twice already, once last night, once this morning. Olivia was right. The SHPO filing error hadn't been an accident. The internal review that Daniel had cited as the reason for deferring the correction didn't exist. There was no paper trail for it, no meeting records, no email chain, nothing that would support the characterization of it as a legitimate procedural hold. What there was, instead, was a timeline, a careful one. The correction request had been submitted on October 3rd by a junior analyst in the development office named Kevin Park, no relation to the investor, who had noticed the address discrepancy during a routine data audit and flagged it in good faith. Daniel's authorization deferral was time-stamped October 4th, less than 18 hours later. 4 days after that, Kevin Park had been quietly reassigned to a different project. His access to the Eastside Corridor files had been revoked on October 9th, logged as a routine project rotation. There were 2 other anomalies in the survey data. Properties with ownership records that didn't match the current occupants, not dramatically, not in a way that would jump out at a casual review, but enough. Enough to create uncertainty, enough to complicate any legal challenge an affected resident might try to bring. It was, Vanessa thought, the kind of thing that was very difficult to prove was intentional, which was, almost certainly, the point. She sat with her coffee and thought about Daniel Cross for a while. She'd known him for 4 years. He'd been brought in by the board as an executive partner when Sterling Horizon first started scaling up, and he was genuinely good at what he did, the relationship management, the investor architecture, the long-game strategic thinking. She'd relied on him. She'd trusted him with significant authority because he'd earned it, or seemed to. She was now sitting with the question of how much of what she'd taken as earned was actually manufactured, and how much she'd wanted to believe it because it was easier than watching everything closely herself. That was not a comfortable question. She picked up her phone and called the company's outside counsel, Diane Wu, whose firm handled Sterling Horizon's significant legal matters, and who had been retained specifically because she was the kind of attorney who told clients things they didn't want to hear. Diane answered on the third ring with the alert focus of someone who didn't receive calls at 6:45 in the morning and understood immediately that it meant something. "I need a meeting today," Vanessa said. "You and me. No one else from your firm yet. I've got documentation of what looks like deliberate suppression of a regulatory filing, possible survey data manipulation, and a personnel action that may have been intended to prevent internal disclosure. I need to know what I'm actually looking at before I decide how to move." A pause. 7:30, Diane said. 7:30, Vanessa confirmed. "My office." She hung up and looked back at the documents. Outside, Atlanta was beginning its morning traffic building on Peachtree, the sky doing something uncertain between overcast and clear, the city getting up and going about its business regardless. Vanessa thought about something Mason Reed had said, not in the conference room, but in the lobby, when Olivia had first brought him to her attention. She hadn't been there for it, but Olivia had quoted it to her afterward, almost verbatim, the way you quote something that stays with you. "I know it looks like what it is, an old truck with 200,000 miles on it." But just that. The sentence stopping there, not finishing, the way the most honest sentences sometimes didn't need to. She thought about what was inside an old truck that looked like nothing. She thought about a green notebook she'd only heard described. She thought about a man who'd driven 40 minutes in the rain to deliver documents for an 81-year-old woman he barely knew, who'd stood on wet asphalt and watched them take his truck, and then turned around and walked back through the door because he still had something to do. Vanessa was not, by nature, a person who spent a lot of time on self-examination. She'd always felt vaguely suspicious of it, the way it could become a substitute for action, a way of feeling like you were doing something important while actually just sitting with yourself. But this morning she was sitting with something that didn't feel comfortable, and she wasn't going to look away from it. She'd spent 6 years building something. She'd worked hard, she'd made good decisions more often than bad ones. She'd rebuilt a company from a struggling holding firm into something that mattered. She was proud of that, and the pride was earned. But she'd also built walls. Not consciously, not with any intent, but incrementally. The way you stop noticing certain things when you're moving fast, when you're looking at the scale of things and not the texture. She'd stopped looking at certain things closely because it was easier and because she'd trusted people she'd appointed to look at them for her. She'd looked out a window and seen a truck that didn't belong. She hadn't seen a man at all. She was trying to sit with that honestly, without turning it into something manageable or finding a way to make herself feel better about it. It was uncomfortable, and she thought it was supposed to be. Her coffee was getting cold. She picked it up anyway. At 7:15, before Diane Wu arrived, Vanessa made one more call. Not to her attorney, not to Olivia, not to anyone at the company. She called the Falcon Towing Claims line and got a human being after 4 minutes on hold, which surprised her. She identified herself, gave Mason's plate number and incident report number, and said she needed the full repair estimate sent to Sterling Horizon's accounts payable department for immediate processing. The claims representative said the estimate was still pending an adjuster review. Vanessa said, "I understand. I'm also going to need the name and contact information for your operations manager because the damage occurred during a tow that was ordered by this company, and I want to make sure the full costs are covered without the vehicle owner needing to navigate an insurance dispute." The representative put her on hold again. While she was on hold, Olivia appeared in her doorway with another folder. More documents, printed and flagged with colored tabs. Olivia's particular organizational system that Vanessa had once teased her about and now understood was the only reason anything was findable at all. Olivia looked at her on hold. "Claims line?" she said. "Reed's truck," Vanessa said. Olivia nodded, set the folder on the desk, started to leave. "Olivia," Vanessa said. She turned. "You should have been briefed on the East Side project 3 weeks ago, when the first questions started coming up. I don't know why you weren't, but I should have made sure you were." Olivia was quiet for a moment. "That's true," she said. Not coldly, just accurately. "I'm fixing that," Vanessa said. "I know," Olivia said. "That's why I worked until 10 last night." She left before Vanessa could respond to that. The claims representative came back on the line and asked for an email address. Vanessa gave it and went back to waiting for her attorney, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do. Forward. without asking whether you were ready. 3 weeks later, Kevin Park, the young analyst who'd been quietly reassigned after flagging the address discrepancy, sat across from Diane Wu in a conference room and talked for 2.5 hours. He was 26 years old. He'd graduated from Georgia Tech 18 months ago. He'd been excited to get the job at Sterling Horizon because they were doing interesting things. He'd said, big things, and he'd wanted to be part of it. He'd noticed the address discrepancy during a data audit on a Wednesday afternoon and flagged it because that was what you were supposed to do when you noticed something wrong. He'd submitted the correction request on a Thursday morning. On Friday afternoon, Daniel Cross had called him into his office and told him, in terms Kevin had described as professional and completely impossible to argue with, that his skills would be better utilized on a different project. The reassignment had felt like recognition at the time, or Kevin had convinced himself it felt like recognition, because the alternative was harder to process. The alternative was that he'd been moved because he'd noticed something someone didn't want noticed. "When did you figure out that was what happened?" Diane Wu asked him. Kevin looked at the table. "When I read about the investor meeting in the company newsletter," he said. "When I saw that someone from outside had brought in the same documents I flagged, and the story was that it had been discovered through an external review." He paused. "I'm not stupid." "Nobody said you were," Diane said. "No," Kevin looked up. "But somebody acted like I was, or like I wouldn't notice, or like I wouldn't say anything." He paused again. "That's almost worse." Diane looked at him steadily. "Will you put this in writing?" Kevin was quiet for 3 seconds. "Yeah," he said. "I will." Mason didn't know about Kevin Park. He didn't know about Diane Wu's investigation, or the depositions, or the series of uncomfortable conversations happening in offices above his pay grade and outside his field of vision. He knew what Olivia had told him. Briefly, in a phone call 2 weeks after the meeting, which was that things were being handled and that the East Side project had been formally paused pending a full compliance review, and that the demolition notices on Donnelly Avenue had been rescinded. That was enough. He was in the shop most evenings that month, working on the truck. The frame alignment had been the worst of it. That took 3 days of careful work with equipment that argued with him, and 2 consultations with his friend Marcus, who knew bodywork the way Mason knew engines, and was honest about where the damage ended and where the structural integrity began. The panel work was more straightforward. The headlight housing he ordered from a parts supplier in Birmingham who specialized in older Chevy models and shipped within 48 hours. Noah helped most weekends. He was not a natural mechanic. He lacked the patience for the slow, incremental nature of the work. The way progress was measured in millimeters and hours, and frequently wasn't visible from day to day. But he showed up, and he handed Mason tools when asked, and occasionally he lay on a creeper under the truck and shone a flashlight where Mason pointed without complaining too much. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 weeks in, Noah asked from under the truck, "Dad, why are we fixing this one instead of getting a new one?" Mason was working on the panel seam, fitting it back to a tolerances he wasn't entirely satisfied with yet. "Because this one's ours," he said, "but the new one would be better." "Better how?" Noah was quiet for a second, thinking about it with the seriousness he brought to actual questions. Like, nicer, newer, better gas mileage, probably. Probably, yeah. "So why not?" "Because this one was here," Mason said. He paused, finding the words. "This truck was in the hospital parking lot the morning you were born. Your mom drove it home with you in the back seat, which she was terrified about, by the way. You've taken about 40 naps in the back seat of this truck. We drove it to the coast the summer before she got sick." He stopped. "A new truck doesn't have any of that." A long pause from under the truck. "Oh," Noah said. "Then can I see the notebook sometime?" Mason's hand stilled on the panel seam. He'd shown Noah the notebook once, 2 years ago, briefly. He'd been worried it was too soon, too much, but Noah had held it very carefully and looked at the pages with a quiet focus that had surprised him. Not reading all of it, just looking at the handwriting, the way you look at something you want to remember the shape of. "Yeah," Mason said. "We can look at it together sometime." "Okay," Noah said, and went back to shining the flashlight. The shop was warm and smelled like metal and oil and the space heater Marcus had lent them. And outside it was dark by 5 o'clock now, the Georgia October doing its slow lean toward November. And Mason worked on the truck until his hands ached and then kept going a little longer because some things were worth the extra time. The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Vanessa had been dreading it in the specific way she dreaded things she couldn't avoid. Not with panic, but with a low, persistent awareness, like a stone in a shoe you keep forgetting about until you take a step. She'd requested the special session herself, which was either the right move or the professional equivalent of building your own gallows, and she hadn't entirely decided which. Sterling Horizon's board had 7 members. 3 of them had been her father's appointments, carried over when she took the helm. 2 she'd brought in herself during the company's expansion years. 1 was an independent director the investors had insisted on during a 2021 refinancing, a retired federal judge named Harold Kessler who asked questions the way surgeons made incisions, precise, unhurried, and always slightly deeper than you expected. The 7th was a woman named Margaret Chu, who had been on the board so long that she'd become a kind of institutional memory, the person in the room who remembered every previous crisis and who could tell you with unsettling accuracy which ones had been survived and how. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes early, which was her habit, and found Margaret already there. Margaret was 71, small, and wore her silver hair cut short with the practicality of someone who'd decided decades ago that she had better things to think about. She was standing at the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the city with the unhurried patience of someone who understood that cities, like companies, were always in the process of becoming something else. "Margaret," Vanessa said. "You look tired," Margaret said without turning around. "I've been told that a lot lately." "It means people are paying attention." Margaret turned from the window. She looked at Vanessa with the evaluating directness that had initially unnerved Vanessa when she first took over and now felt like one of the most reliable things in her professional life. "How bad is it? The real number, not the version from the briefing document." Vanessa considered how to answer that. "The project can be saved," she said. "The compliance issues are fixable. The Callaway Group hasn't pulled out. What's bad is that it happened at all. And that it happened because I gave Daniel Cross too much unsupervised authority over a project I should have been closer to." "That's a clean answer," Margaret said. "Is it the honest one?" Vanessa looked at her. "What's the less clean version?" "The less clean version," Margaret said, "is that you built a management structure that functioned well when everyone in it was acting in good faith, and you didn't build adequate safeguards for the possibility that someone wasn't. That's not a character flaw. It's a structural one. But you need to name it correctly if you're going to fix it correctly." Vanessa absorbed this for a moment. "You've given that speech before," she said. "I've given a version of it to every CEO I've worked with," Margaret said, setting her tea down. "The good ones listen." The other board members arrived in the next 10 minutes, and then the meeting began, and Vanessa did the thing she'd spent 15 years preparing herself to do, which was stand in front of people who had authority over her future and tell them the truth about something that reflected badly on her, precisely and completely, without softening the edges. She walked through the timeline, the SHPO filing error and its origins, Daniel Cross's authorization deferral, and Kevin Park's reassignment, the occupied homes, the Heritage House, the chain of assumptions and deliberate misdirections that had brought a $340 million project to the edge of a compliance collapse. She presented Diane Wu's preliminary findings. She presented the remediation plan that she and Olivia had spent 3 12-hour days constructing, a full independent audit of the East Side Corridor surveys, direct outreach to every affected resident, a new SHPO filing that was already in process, a restructured oversight framework for all active projects. She also told them about Mason Reed. Not in great detail. The board didn't need a narrative, they needed facts. But she told them the relevant facts clearly. That a private citizen with no legal standing and no financial stake had driven 40 minutes in a rainstorm to deliver documentation that could have prevented a regulatory and reputational catastrophe, and that her first response had been to have his truck towed because it didn't look right in her parking lot. Harold Kessler, who had been quiet through most of the presentation, said at that point, "Did you tell him that?" "Yes," Vanessa said. "What did he say?" Vanessa thought about it for a moment. "How'd that work out?" she said. A pause. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Kessler looked at his notes, and then looked back up at Vanessa with an expression that had shifted slightly. Not warmly, not harshly, just with something that might have been a fractional upward revision of something. "What's your recommendation on Cross?" he asked. "Termination for cause, pending completion of the external review," Vanessa said. "And we cooperate fully with any regulatory inquiry. I'm not interested in managing this. I want it dealt with." "That will be expensive," said one of the original board members, a man named Philip Garrett, who had been her father's closest friend on the board, and who was not a bad person but who had a reflex, when problems arose, toward containment rather than resolution. "If we cooperate with a regulatory inquiry, we're inviting scrutiny that could—" "Philip," Vanessa said, not unkindly, "there are 11 families on Donnelly Avenue who had demolition notices on their doors. One of them is 81 years old and has been running a one-woman records campaign for 6 weeks because nobody at this company took her calls seriously. If we try to manage that instead of fix it, the story we end up in is a lot worse than the story we're in now." Philip was quiet. "I agree with the recommendation," Margaret said. Kessler looked around the table. "All in favor of proceeding with the remediation plan as presented?" 6 hands. Philip's went up last after a pause, but it went up. The vote was not the hard part. The hard part, which Vanessa hadn't fully anticipated because she'd been too focused on the board meeting, was what happened in the 2 weeks after it. Daniel Cross had retained an attorney within 24 hours of being placed on administrative leave. His attorney sent a letter to Sterling Horizon's general counsel asserting that the termination was retaliatory, that Daniel had acted within the scope of his authority in deferring the correction request, and that any characterization of his actions as deliberate misconduct was both legally unsupported and defamatory. The letter was 14 pages and very well written, and Diane Wu read it twice and then called Vanessa and said, "He's going to fight this." "I expected that," Vanessa said. "It's going to be expensive and unpleasant and slow," Diane said. "I know. And there's a real chance," Diane said carefully, "that some of what he did is in a gray area legally. The deferral was his call to make, arguably. The personnel action on Park was handled through HR in a way that's technically defensible. The question of whether he knew the demolition schedule was proceeding without legal clearance, that's going to come down to email records, and he's got good enough counsel that the email records are going to be contested." "What are you telling me?" Vanessa asked. "I'm telling you the honest version," Diane said, "which is that doing the right thing in this situation is going to require you to spend significant money, take significant legal risk, and accept that you might not get a clean resolution. He may not get fired for cause. He may get a settlement. He may get to write his own exit narrative." Vanessa sat with that for a moment. "Do it anyway," she said. "Vanessa, he moved a 26-year-old analyst off a project and revoked his file access because the kid noticed something wrong and did his job," she said. "Kevin Park spent 3 weeks wondering if he'd made a mistake by flagging a data discrepancy. 3 weeks of thinking maybe he'd misread the situation. Maybe he'd been too aggressive. Maybe there was a good reason he'd been moved. That's not a gray area to me." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Then we proceed." The East Side Corridor project didn't die. That was, Vanessa thought, both a relief and a kind of ongoing test. Because the temptation, when you were trying to demonstrate that a project had changed, was to change everything visible and leave the underlying structure alone. New framing, same foundation. She'd seen companies do it. She'd seen it work in the short term. She was trying very hard not to do that. The revised project design took 11 weeks. She brought in an urban planning consultant named Renata Garcia, who had a reputation for being difficult to work with, and who justified it within the first meeting by pointing out, with a specificity that was almost audible, everything that was wrong with the original neighborhood integration model. Vanessa liked her immediately. Renata's approach was simpler than the original plan and more expensive in its implementation, and significantly better in every way that actually mattered. Instead of displacing the current residents and replacing the neighborhood with new construction, the revised design built around the existing community, preserving the housing stock that was still viable, investing in rehabilitation rather than demolition, centering the heritage house as the anchor of the development rather than an obstacle to it. The commercial development moved to the underused industrial blocks at the northern end of the corridor. The community spaces expanded, The investors required an additional 60 days to review the revised plan. Calloway called Vanessa directly after his team had gone through it and said, "This is a better project." He didn't apologize for the delay or acknowledge what had happened in October in any explicit way. He just said it was a better project and confirmed that his group was in. Simmons and Park followed within a week. The project that ultimately broke ground in the spring was not the $340 million plan that had almost gone catastrophically wrong. It was a $290 million plan that would take longer, cost more per unit to execute, and probably generate less short-term return. It was also something that Vanessa, looking at the revised plans, felt she could actually be proud of. Not the abstracted pride of a successful financial instrument, but something more specific. The kind of pride that comes from looking at a thing and knowing it was made carefully. She wasn't sure she'd felt that before. Not like this. What she didn't tell the board, what she hadn't told Diane Wu or Olivia or anyone, was that she'd driven past Donnelly Avenue on a Saturday afternoon in November, by herself, with no appointment and no plan. She'd parked on the street, in an old Camry she kept for non-work driving, which felt relevant somehow, though she couldn't have said exactly why, and walked the block. It was a real neighborhood. She'd known that, intellectually, from the documents and the survey data and the resident records Olivia had compiled. But knowing something from a document and walking through it were different experiences, and she was standing in the middle of the second experience, realizing how long she'd been living exclusively in the first one. There was a man raking leaves in his front yard who looked up when she passed and said, "Good morning." 2 kids on bikes. A woman sitting on a porch step with a mug who watched her with mild curiosity. A block that had been standing since the 1950s, that had weathered the full history of the city, that had nearly been on the wrong end of a bulldozer because someone in her company had decided the data said it was empty. She stood in front of the Heritage House. It was a 2-story brick building set back from the street, with wide front steps and a hand-painted sign in the window that said East Side Heritage House, community events this week, and listed 3 things in marker below it. The brickwork was old, the kind that had settled into itself over 60 years and developed the slight irregularities that newer construction never had. The front door was propped open with a cinder block. She could hear voices inside. She almost went in. She stood on the sidewalk and almost went in, and then didn't, because she wasn't ready to have a conversation she hadn't earned yet. Because walking in and introducing herself as the CEO of the company that had nearly demolished the place seemed like the kind of thing you needed to work up to. She walked back to the car. She sat there for a minute. Then she took out her phone and called Olivia. "I need you to set up a resident meeting," she said. "Formal, not corporate. Community space, not our office. I want to meet the people on Donnelly Avenue, and I want it to be their territory, not mine." Olivia was quiet for a second. "When are you thinking?" "As soon as they're willing," Vanessa said. "I'm not setting the timeline." "Okay," Olivia said. "I'll reach out to Eleanor Marsh first." "Good," Vanessa said. And then before she hung up, "Olivia, what I said in the board meeting about the management structure, that applies to you too. You've been doing compliance work at this company for 3 years and nobody had you in the room when the East Side project was being designed. That's a structural problem and it's fixed going forward, but I'm telling you directly so there's no ambiguity about it." Olivia took a moment to respond. "I appreciate that," she said. "And for the record, I should have pushed harder to be in the room. I noticed I wasn't, and I told myself it was because the project was still in early phases. That was easier than making an issue of it." "Yeah," Vanessa said, "it usually is." She drove home through a city that was doing its Saturday afternoon business all around her, and thought about the things that were easier not to look at closely, and how long you could go without looking before the cost arrived. The resident meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in the first week of December, in the main hall of the Heritage House. Eleanor Marsh had organized it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been organizing things in that neighborhood for 50 years and didn't need to be told how. There were folding chairs set up in rows, a table with coffee and something Eleanor had baked that turned out to be a pound cake, and about 30 people in attendance, residents from Donnelly Avenue and the surrounding blocks, a few of whom Vanessa recognized from the survey files and most of whom she didn't. Vanessa came alone. She'd offered to bring Olivia and Renata Garcia, and Olivia had advised against it. "This isn't a presentation," Olivia had said. Go alone and listen more than you talk. She'd taken the advice. Eleanor Marsh was smaller than Vanessa had imagined, compact and upright, with white hair and careful eyes, and the particular authority of someone who had been underestimated so many times that she'd stopped bothering to correct it and just waited for events to do it for her. She met Vanessa at the door with a handshake that was firm, without performing firmness. You came, Eleanor said. You invited me, Vanessa said. I invited you, Eleanor agreed, which means something different than you inviting yourself. Come in. The meeting was not comfortable. Vanessa hadn't expected it to be, and had told herself she wasn't going to try to make it comfortable, which was different from actually doing that in a room full of people who had legitimate grievances and were looking at her with an understandable mix of skepticism and residual anger. A man named Thomas Reeves, who was in his 50s and had lived in his house on Donnelly for 22 years, told her directly that he'd had a demolition notice on his door for 2 weeks before anyone from Sterling Horizon had acknowledged the error. He'd spent those 2 weeks making calls that went unanswered and filing complaints with the city planning office that had been routed to the wrong department. He told his daughter, who was in college in Savannah, that he might have to move. She'd offered to come home. He told her not to because he was a man who didn't want his daughter interrupting her education because someone else had made a mess. And then it got fixed, he said, and now you're here. And I want to know what you're going to tell me to make sure this doesn't happen again. Vanessa didn't have a clean answer. She told him what she had, which was the audit, the revised oversight structure, the direct channels to the compliance office that any affected resident could now use. She told him it wasn't enough on its own, that audits and structures were only as good as the people running them, and that the honest answer to his question was that she couldn't guarantee something like this never happened again. Nobody could guarantee that, but that she was trying to build something different than what had been there before. Thomas Reeves looked at her for a long moment. That's a fair answer, he said. Not warmly, just accurately. The way Mason had spoken accurately without warmth, and Vanessa was beginning to understand that this was what honesty sounded like from people who'd been given too many comfortable lies. She answered questions for 2 hours. Some of them were hostile, some were practical, some were both. She didn't get defensive. She didn't reach for talking points. She got things wrong twice. Once citing an incorrect timeline for a community consultation process, which Eleanor corrected with the precision of someone who had looked at the actual documents, and once misremembering a specific property address, which a woman named Deb Holloway corrected with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for exactly that moment. Vanessa thanked them both for the corrections. After the formal meeting had wound down and people were getting coffee and talking in smaller groups, Eleanor found her near the back of the room and handed her a piece of pound cake on a small paper plate. You did all right, Eleanor said. I got 2 things wrong, Vanessa said. Yes, Eleanor said. And you said thank you instead of sorry, which is the correct response. She paused. You know what Mason said to me when he called after your meeting? He said he thought you were someone who could learn from this. I told him that was a generous read. He said he didn't think generosity had much to do with it. Vanessa looked at her. What does that mean? I think it means he wasn't being generous, Eleanor said. He was just watching closely. She ate a piece of her own pound cake. He watches people closely. It's a good quality, underrated. He does, Vanessa agreed. She thought about the conference room, the way he'd noticed Daniel Cross's hand move on the table, the way he'd answered Vanessa's apology without accepting or rejecting it, just noting the reality of it and moving on. The economy of the way he communicated, the sense that every word had been considered before it appeared. How well do you know him? Vanessa asked. Well enough, Eleanor said. He came over on a Saturday and sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours, going through 50 years of paper I'd been keeping because I didn't know what else to do with it. He could have just looked at the important parts and left. He didn't. He read all of it. She paused. You learn things about a person from what they read carefully. Vanessa thought about that. She thought about it on the drive home. She called Mason a week after the resident meeting. She'd been trying to figure out whether to call for longer than that. There were practical reasons to call, the truck repair costs, the details that needed to be finalized, and she'd been using the practical reasons as cover for the fact that she wasn't sure how to have the conversation she actually wanted to have. She was not, by nature, good at conversations without clear objectives. She'd built her professional life on knowing what she wanted from every exchange before she walked into it, and she couldn't entirely figure out what she wanted from this one. In the end, she called because not calling was starting to feel like another thing she was choosing not to look at closely. He answered on the third ring, with background noise she identified after a moment as the shop. The particular ambient sound of a working garage, metal and air tools, and something running in the background. "Mr. Reed," she said, "this is Vanessa Sterling. I hope I'm not interrupting." "You're not," he said. "Give me 1 second." The background noise faded slightly. He'd moved somewhere quieter. "What can I do for you?" She'd prepared a practical opening. The repair costs, the settlement from Falcon Towing, the Sterling Horizon additional contribution. She had the numbers. She went through them. Mason was quiet through most of it. "That's more than the damage was worth," he said when she'd finished. "We're also covering the full restoration," she said. "Whatever it costs to get the truck back to original condition, parts, labor. Olivia found a specialist in vintage Chevy restoration in Marietta if you want a referral, but if you'd rather do it yourself, that's... The number holds either way." A longer pause. "You don't owe me a restoration," Mason said. "I know that," Vanessa said. Another pause. "But you're offering it anyway." "Yeah," she said. She waited. She'd learned in the last 2 months to sit in silences instead of filling them. It was harder than it sounded. "Why?" he asked. And it wasn't a challenge. It was the same quality of question he asked everything, direct and genuinely interested in the answer. Vanessa thought about it honestly. "Because I made a decision about you before I knew anything about you," she said. "And that decision cost you something you can't replace. The money covers the damage, but it doesn't cover that. I don't know what does, but..." She stopped and started again. "There's a notebook in that glove compartment. I've never seen it. I don't know what's in it, but I know it's there, and I know why it's there, and I know that if it had been lost because of an order I gave, I would have had to live with that." Silence. "It wasn't lost," Mason said quietly. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Another pause. "The restoration money," he said. "I want to do the work myself. I'll take the parts cost." "That's fine." "And..." He stopped. She waited. "There's a community center on Donnelly Avenue, the Heritage House. Eleanor told me they've been trying to get the heating system replaced for 2 years. The old furnace is..." "I know about the furnace," Vanessa said. "It's already in the revised project budget. Full HVAC system, new installation scheduled for February." A beat. "Okay," Mason said. And there was something in the way he said it, just that one word, that was not gratitude exactly, but was adjacent to it. Like relief. Like the specific relief of something being taken care of that you'd been worried about, for someone you cared about, by someone who didn't have to. "Thank you," he said, "for that." "Don't thank me," she said. "It should have been in the original design." He didn't argue with her on that. She drove to his shop on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of December. She'd told herself she was going for practical reasons, to drop off a signed copy of the settlement agreement, which could have been handled by courier, but which she'd decided, somewhere between her desk and the parking garage, to handle in person. It was the kind of decision that only makes sense if you're honest about why you're making it, which she was trying to be. The shop was in Decatur, on a commercial strip between a tire place and a dry cleaner, with a hand-painted sign above the bay doors that said, "Reed Auto," the lettering slightly uneven in a way that felt deliberate rather than careless. The kind of sign you make yourself because having someone else make it doesn't feel right. 2 of the 3 bays were occupied. A Honda Civic on a lift, a newer F-150 with its hood up. The 3rd bay was where the old Silverado was. She could see it from the entrance, the front end partially disassembled, the damaged panel removed and leaning against the wall. Mason was under the F-150. He rolled out on a creeper when she pulled in, looked at her car for a moment and then at her. She was wearing jeans and a winter coat, not a blazer, which she'd also told herself was a practical decision, and which was also something else. "I brought the settlement paperwork," she said, and held up the folder. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag, and took the folder. He looked through it briefly. Not just the signature page, actually reading it, the way he read everything, and then looked up. You added a right of appeal clause, he said, if I'm not satisfied with the final restoration quality. Olivia added it, Vanessa said. I just signed off. Tell her thank you. Tell her yourself, Vanessa said. She's the one who actually caught it. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. She looked past him at the Silverado. How's it going? Mason turned and looked at it with her, the same way you look at a problem you're in the middle of. Not finished, not stuck, just mid-process. Frames aligned. Panel work is harder than I thought because the original bodywork had some old repairs I didn't know about, so I'm working around previous damage while fixing the new damage, which, he paused, is usually how it goes. Usually how what goes? He looked at her. Repair work, he said. You think you're fixing one thing, and you find out there was something underneath it that needed fixing too. He looked back at the truck. That's not a bad thing necessarily. Just means the job takes longer. She looked at the truck for a moment. I went to Donnelly Avenue, she said. Before the resident meeting, by myself. I just walked through. He didn't say anything. It's a real neighborhood, she said, and then felt slightly stupid saying it out loud because it was obvious. Yeah, he said. I think I'd stopped thinking of it that way, she said. When it was a line on a project map, it becomes abstract. And I let it stay abstract because it was easier to think about the project at scale than to think about the specific. She paused. That's not a new realization. People have been saying that about development projects for as long as there have been development projects. But knowing the critique and actually feeling it are different. Mason looked at her. Eleanor told me you read all her documents, Vanessa said. Not just the relevant ones. All of them. She kept good records, Mason said simply. She did, Vanessa said. She kept 50 years of good records because she believed they'd matter eventually, and she didn't know who else was going to keep them. She paused. That seems like a lot of faith in something that wasn't guaranteed to work out. It worked out, Mason said, because you drove the documents downtown in a rainstorm, because she kept them for 50 years. He picked up the rag again, turned it in his hands. I just drove. That's not the hard part. She thought about what Eleanor had said. He didn't just look at the important parts. He read all of it. And what that meant about a person, that he read the whole thing, the careful 50-year record of a neighborhood kept by a woman who couldn't have known in 1971 or 1982 or 1995, whether any of it would ever matter. He'd read it because she'd kept it, and both of those things were the same kind of thing, really. The same refusal to decide in advance what deserved attention. Vanessa looked at the truck. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. The truck. The restoration. She paused, finding the words. You said the new one couldn't replace it. But the restoration. When it's done, it's still not going to be exactly what it was. You're building around old repairs. Some of what was there is gone. Yeah, he said. So what are you restoring exactly? He was quiet for a moment, turning the rag in his hands. The parts that are worth keeping, he said, and making it solid enough to carry them. She stood with that for a moment. Behind them, in the far bay, something clanged. A dropped tool, probably. And then she heard a voice. Sorry, that was me. Young, male, slightly mortified. Mason looked over his shoulder. You okay, Noah? I'm fine, I just dropped a pause. The thing. The ratchet, Mason said. Yeah, that. Mason looked back at Vanessa with the expression of a parent who has made peace with the word that is a universal noun in the hands of a 10-year-old. My son, he said. I figured, she said. She stayed for another 20 minutes. They talked about the Heritage House HVAC timeline, and about the revised project schedule, and about a drainage issue on the northern blocks of the corridor that Renata Garcia had flagged, and that Mason, who had apparently been following the public planning documents because of course he had questions about. They stood in the bay door in the cold December air and talked about it in the straightforward way of two people who were discussing something they both cared about. And it was strange and not strange, and at some point Vanessa realized they'd stopped talking about anything with a practical resolution and were just talking. When she finally left, walking back to her car through the cold, she heard Noah's voice from inside the shop. Was that the lady from the building? And Mason's voice. Yeah. Is she nice? A pause. She's learning, Mason said. She sat in her car for a moment in the cold and looked at the shop through the windshield. The lights in the bay were on, warm against the gray afternoon, and she could see the shapes of the two of them moving in there. Mason back under something, Noah handing him a tool, the ordinary domestic machinery of a man and his kid doing something together on a Friday afternoon. She drove away into the December city, which was doing its end-of-year business all around her, lit up and moving fast, full of things that would not pause to be examined and things that deserved to be. She thought about the parts worth keeping. She thought about making things solid enough to carry them. She drove. January came in cold and gray and stayed that way. Mason had a theory about January. Not a philosophy, just an observation he'd made over enough years that it felt reliable, which was that the month had a particular quality of honesty to it. December was all noise and motion, the city dressed up and performing its best version of itself. Then January arrived and stripped all that away and left you with whatever was actually there. Some years that was fine, some years it wasn't, but it was always true, which he respected. The shop was busy in January. It always was. People had neglected things in December, put off the slow oil leak, the grinding brake, the heater that worked intermittently and that you'd decided to live with until after the holidays. They came in the first 2 weeks of the new year with the accumulated deferred maintenance of the previous 2 months. And Mason and his one employee, a 30-year-old named Darius who had been with him for 3 years and had the rare quality of being both fast and careful, worked through the backlog steadily. The Silverado was in the third bay. It was there every day when Mason came in and every evening when he left, and in the odd hours between jobs. The 20 minutes while a diagnostic ran, the half hour at the end of a day when the shop had gone quiet. He worked on it. The front end was almost complete. The panel work had taken longer than he'd estimated, not because it was beyond his skill, but because he was being more careful than strictly necessary, working at a pace that had less to do with efficiency and more to do with intention. He was not rushing it. He was not going to rush it. Darius had noticed. "You're spending more time on that truck than anything that's come through here in 2 years," Darius said one Wednesday afternoon, looking up from the Civic he was finishing up. "Yeah," Mason said. "Is that a financial decision?" "No." Darius looked at the Silverado, then back at Mason. He was a man who knew when to ask follow-up questions and when to leave something alone. He looked back at the Civic. "Looks good," he said, meaning the Silverado. "Getting there," Mason said. Vanessa came back to the shop on a Thursday in the second week of January. She told herself the first visit had been practical. This one, she didn't bother telling herself anything. She just came, in the same old Camry and jeans and a coat, at 4 in the afternoon on a day when she'd had 3 meetings cancel in sequence and found herself with 2 hours that belonged, unusually, to her. She'd thought about calling first. Then she thought about what that phone call would sound like and decided to just go. Mason was working on a pickup, someone else's, newer, an F250 with an exhaust issue, when she pulled in. He looked up from under the hood the same way he had the first time, with the unhurried attention of someone who processes things before he responds to them. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "I was in the area." He looked at her. "That's not entirely true," she said. "Okay," he said, without judgment. He went back to the F250 for a moment, made an adjustment, then stepped back and wiped his hands. "Coffee's in the office. It's old." "That's fine," she said. She got herself a cup of coffee from the machine in his small back office. It was old, dark enough to stand a spoon in, the kind of coffee that had been sitting long enough to develop a personality, and came back to the bay and stood near the Silverado. The progress since December was visible. The front end had come back together. Both panels were on. The headlight housing was new, bright against the weathered paint on the rest of the cab. The frame alignment was done. She could see the geometry of it, the way the truck sat level and true now. All 4 corners making the same argument with the ground. The driver's side door no longer had the scrape from the toe. Someone had taken this time to blend the repair into the surrounding paint with a patience that made the damage nearly invisible. "It's looking like itself again," she said. Mason came and stood beside her, looking at the truck with the particular expression of someone assessing work. Not satisfied, not dissatisfied, just honest. Almost, he said. Paint's next, and then the interior's got some things I've been wanting to fix for a while, so I'll do those while I have her apart. You said you'd been wanting to fix the interior for a while, she said. Before all this. Dashboard crack, couple of other things. So you're fixing things that had nothing to do with the damage. If I'm restoring it, he said. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said most things. She drank the terrible coffee and looked at the truck. I met with the Heritage House Board last week, she said. The HVAC contractor is scheduled for February 15th. Eleanor made me walk through the whole building first before she'd let me sit down. Mason looked at her. And the furnace room looks like a scene from an industrial horror film, she said. It's a miracle that thing has been running at all. Eleanor told me, Mason said. 2 winters ago, it stopped completely for 10 days. She brought in space heaters. There were kids in that building. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. There's more I want to do out there, she said, beyond what's already in the project budget, not as Sterling Horizon as... She stopped, finding the right word. I don't know, just as someone who should have been paying attention sooner. Mason looked at her. You have money. I do. Then use it, he said. Not dismissive, practical. But ask Eleanor what she needs before you decide what to give. That's the part people usually skip. I know, she said. I'm learning not to skip it. He looked at her with something that was not quite approval, but was in that neighborhood. What did she say when you asked her? Vanessa said. The first time. What she needed. She said she needed someone to sit down and read her papers, Mason said. That's it. That was the whole thing. Nobody had sat down and actually read them. He paused. She had the answer the whole time. She just needed someone to take it seriously. Vanessa thought about that for a while, standing in the January light coming through the bay doors, holding a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long, and neither of them said anything for a minute, which was comfortable in a way that surprised her slightly. Can I ask you something personal? She said. He glanced over. Probably. How do you do it? She said. I don't know how to ask this without sounding like I'm asking a self-help question. Then ask the self-help question, he said. She looked at him. He wasn't mocking her. He was just telling her to say the actual thing. How do you stay level, she said, in situations that would make most people lose it? The morning at my building, the truck being towed, the damage. You never... She paused. You never blew up. You never made it about yourself in a way that would have been completely understandable. I watched you in that conference room when Daniel was trying to dismiss you, and you just... I was angry, he said. She stopped. I was angry the whole time, he said. I don't have some system. I was standing on that parking lot, watching them take my truck, and I was angry enough that I had to focus really hard on breathing for about 30 seconds. He paused. But I had something to do. I had documents that needed to get into the right hands, and there were people depending on that happening. When you have something specific to do, it's easier to put the anger in a different pocket for a while. And when you don't have something specific to do? He was quiet for a moment. Then it's harder, he said. She absorbed that. It was the most honest answer he could have given, and she knew it. And she thought she'd been half expecting something more composed, some framework, some hard-won wisdom packaged into a transferable lesson. Instead, she'd gotten, I was angry, I had something to do, it's harder when you don't. Which was real, and which was also applicable in every direction she pointed it. My father used to say something, she said. She hadn't planned to say this. It came out the way things come out when you're not managing yourself carefully. He said the problem with running things is that you start to feel like the running is the point, and then the things you were running for, they get further away. Mason was quiet. He built this company, she said. He was running it for 10 years before he got sick. I think by the end he'd forgotten what he'd started it for. He just ran it because that was what he knew how to do. She paused. I took it over and I told myself I wasn't going to do that. And then I looked up and it was 6 years later and I was looking at a truck in my parking lot and deciding it didn't belong there based on nothing. What'd he start it for? Mason asked. Build things, she said. Real things. Things people could live and work in. He grew up in public housing in Birmingham and he always said he wanted to do it better, not just cheaper, better. She paused. I think he meant it. I think somewhere in the execution it got abstract. Does it feel like that to you? Mason said. Now? She thought about the Heritage House board meeting, about Eleanor walking her through the building before she'd let her sit down, about Thomas Reeves and the 2 weeks he'd spent wondering if he was going to have to call his daughter home from college. Less than it did, she said. She started coming by the shop on Thursdays. Not every Thursday, 2 out of 3, roughly, and she didn't examine the scheduling too closely because examining it would have required naming something she wasn't quite ready to name. She told herself it was because the East Side project had ongoing connection to Mason. He'd been the one to bring the compliance issues forward. The resident community trusted him. There were occasional practical reasons to be in contact. These reasons were real. They were also not the whole story, and she knew it. What she could say, factually, was that the shop had become one of the few places she went where nobody wanted something from her, where the conversation was about things that weren't filtered through institutional agenda, where she could stand in a bay door and drink bad coffee and say things without calibrating them first. That was rarer than it sounded in the life she led. Noah got used to her. This happened incrementally, the way kids get used to things, not through a decision but through repetition. The first few Thursdays, he'd treated her with the watchful assessment of a child who has learned not to invest in adults who appear and disappear. He would look up, acknowledge her, and return to whatever he was doing with a neutrality that was clearly somewhat practiced. She'd noticed it and hadn't pushed against it. She just kept showing up and kept acting the same way each time, which was the only approach she had. About 3 weeks in, Noah asked her what she did. "I run a development company," she said. "We design and build things. Buildings, mostly. Neighborhoods." He thought about this. Like houses? Apartment buildings, community spaces, commercial spaces, big projects. Is that like being an architect? "Architects design the buildings," she said. "I figure out what to build and where and make sure the money works and the permits are right and all the pieces come together." "That sounds like project management," Noah said, with the authority of a 10-year-old who had recently encountered the term somewhere and deployed it at maximum opportunity. Vanessa blinked. Yes, actually. At a certain level, yes." Noah nodded like this confirmed something. "My dad says project management is underrated." "Your dad is correct," she said. Noah seemed to accept this as sufficient common ground and went back to whatever he was doing, which appeared to be attempting to sort a collection of mismatched bolts by size in a way that was more organized than Mason's actual system. Mason, from under a car, said, "Noah, those are sorted already." "They're sorted wrong," Noah said, with the supreme confidence of a child who has decided to improve something that wasn't broken. Mason did not respond to this. Vanessa looked at the ceiling for a moment to contain her expression. The Daniel Cross situation resolved, finally, in February. It resolved badly, which Diane Wu had warned her it might, and which was still worse in practice than it had been in anticipation. Daniel's attorneys had been thorough. The email records were contested. The argument that the deferral of Kevin Park's correction request was a legitimate executive judgment call had proven, in the legal sense, difficult to decisively disprove, not because it was a good argument, but because intent was hard to establish, and Daniel's counsel was skilled at the distinction between something being wrong and something being provably wrong. What they'd arrived at, after 6 weeks of back and forth that Vanessa had found grinding in a way that even the board meeting hadn't been, was a settlement. Daniel left the company with a negotiated exit package that was smaller than what he'd have been entitled to under a standard separation, but larger than nothing, and a non-disparagement agreement that ran both ways, and a clean title. Resigned by mutual agreement. He did not get fired for cause. The file said resigned. Vanessa had sat with the settlement document for a long time before signing it. She'd called Diane Wu and asked one more time whether they could push harder. Diane had told her the same thing she'd said from the beginning. They could push harder, and it would cost more, and the probability of achieving a materially better outcome was not high. And in the meantime, the ongoing legal dispute was consuming resources and attention that the company needed for the East Side remediation. "What about Kevin Park?" Vanessa had asked. "Kevin's situation is separate," Diane said, "and it's better. We've made him whole on back pay, and the reassignment is being classified as improper in the internal record. If he ever needs that documentation, it's there. Does he know that? He was told last week, Diane said. He said thank you. Vanessa had signed the settlement. She hadn't felt good about it. She'd felt like someone who'd done the available right thing instead of the ideal right thing, which was a category she was becoming more familiar with and was not finding comfortable. She told Mason about it on a Thursday, standing in the bay, the Silverado now fully painted and looking more like itself than it had in 15 years. The arrival blue restored to something close to the original shade, which Mason had matched by pulling the original factory code from the door jamb and cross-referencing it with a supplier who specialized in vintage colors. He walked, she said. Technically, it says resigned. Mason was quiet. I know it's not... Does Kevin Park know what happened? Mason asked. Yes. The record is corrected, if he ever needs it. Mason nodded slowly. Does Eleanor know the outcome? He asked. She knows the project is going forward under the new design. She knows the Heritage House is protected and the HVAC is going in next week. Vanessa paused. She doesn't know the specifics of the Daniel Cross situation. Then tell her, Mason said. Not the legal details, just tell her what happened and what the outcome was. She's been watching this from the beginning. She deserves to know how it ended. Even if the ending isn't clean? He looked at her. Especially then, he said. She's 81. She's seen how things end. She'll handle it. Vanessa called Eleanor that evening. Eleanor was quiet for a moment after Vanessa had finished. So he leaves with money in his pocket, Eleanor said. Less than he'd have gotten otherwise, but yes. Another pause. Well, Eleanor said, that's how it usually goes. I'm sorry it couldn't be more. Don't apologize for things you can't control, Eleanor said. You did what you could do. The Heritage House is still standing. My neighbors still have their homes. That's not nothing. A pause. That's actually quite a lot. Yeah, Vanessa said. You come by sometime, Eleanor said. I'll make the pound cake again. I'd like that, Vanessa said. The HVAC installation at the Heritage House was completed on a Friday in the third week of February, 2 days ahead of schedule, which the contractor noted was somewhat unusual and Eleanor noted was completely expected. Vanessa was there when they tested the system. She stood in the main hall of the Heritage House with Eleanor and Thomas Reeves and a small group of people who had been using the building through 2 winters of a furnace that worked when it felt like it, and they listened to the new system come online, the sound of something working properly, which was quiet and unremarkable, and which was, in its quietness, kind of beautiful. Eleanor put her hand on the nearest vent and felt the warm air coming through. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with her hand on the vent, feeling it. Thomas Reeves looked at Vanessa from across the room and nodded once. Not warmly, not coldly. The way people acknowledge something that was owed and has been paid. Vanessa nodded back. That same Friday, Mason finished the interior work on the Silverado. He'd been putting it off, not consciously, but in the way you put off the last part of something important. Wanting to get everything else right first, wanting to save the final piece for when you were ready for it. The interior had always been fine, functionally, the dashboard crack he'd been meaning to fix, the passenger seats fraying along the left edge, which he'd ignored for 2 years, a rattle in the center console that revealed, when he finally opened it, a dime lodged behind the mounting bracket, a detail Claire would have found hilarious, because she'd been the one who lost dimes constantly, finding them in pockets and cup holders and behind couch cushions. He'd held the dime for a moment and then put it back. Some things you left where they were. The dashboard he'd repaired with a vinyl repair kit he'd ordered specifically for the color match, working in 2 sessions to get it right, and the result was not invisible. If you knew where to look, you could see the repair, but it was solid and it was done. The seat he'd restitched along the frayed edge with a leather needle and matching thread, working slowly, which was not a skill he'd had before Claire died, and had taught himself afterward for reasons he'd never entirely articulated. The rattle in the console was solved by the removal of the dime. Friday evening, after Darius had gone home, Mason sat in the driver's seat of the Silverado. He hadn't sat in it since October. He hadn't realized that until now. Hadn't quite registered that the truck being in the shop had meant he never actually sat in it, never occupied the driver's seat since the morning they'd towed it out of the Sterling Horizon lot. He'd worked on it from every angle. He'd never sat in it. He put his hands on the steering wheel. The truck didn't run yet. He hadn't started the engine since bringing it in from the impound lot. There were still things to check before he'd turn it over. But sitting in it was different from having it on a lift. Sitting in it was being in it. He looked at the repaired dashboard. He looked at the rearview mirror, the pine tree air freshener still hanging there, still odorless, still twisting slightly because he'd left the driver's door open and there was a draft. He opened the glove compartment. The notebook was there. He'd moved it to his office safe the day after he brought the truck back from impound, and he'd returned it to the glove compartment just this week, when the work was far enough along that it felt right. He took it out. He opened it. He hadn't opened it in 7 months. He was careful about how often he opened it, for the same reason you're careful about anything you can't replace. Not because you're afraid to use it, but because you want to use it right, at the right time, for the right reasons. Claire's handwriting, small and slightly sideways, the way it always was. She pressed harder on pen than most people, so the letters had a slight texture you could feel with your fingertip. He turned to the truck pages. She'd kept notes about the truck the way she kept notes about everything. Not systematically, just observations when they occurred to her. Gerald is making a noise. Mason says it's normal. I said, describe normal. He said, like that, direct quote. He turned a few pages. Coast trip. Noah slept the whole way there, which, given what he was like for the 3 hours before we left, was either a miracle or a coping mechanism. Gerald behaved perfectly. I told Em that the truck likes the highway. He said the truck doesn't have preferences. I said he's wrong. He sat in the driver's seat and read for a while. When he looked up, it was fully dark outside, and the shop was lit from within, and it had been quiet for he didn't know how long. He sat there for another minute. He wasn't sad exactly. Or he was sad, but it was the kind of sadness that had air in it, that didn't close things down. He'd learned to tell the difference. He closed the notebook. Put it back in the glove compartment. He got out, locked the truck, and went to call Noah, who was at a friend's house and needed to be picked up by 8. Vanessa was at the shop the following Thursday. Mason had called her Tuesday, which was not usual. She typically just appeared on Thursdays, and he typically didn't call, and said the truck was almost ready and she should come by if she wanted to see it before he drove it home. She'd said yes without the pause she probably would have taken 2 months ago. When she arrived, the Silverado was out of the bay and parked in front of the shop, on the flat concrete apron in front of the bay doors, under the late February sky that had finally, grudgingly, moved toward something closer to light. She stopped when she saw it. The paint was the thing that hit her first. Arrival blue, restored, not brand new, not factory floor perfect, but the color as it had been before 15 years of weather and sun had taken it down to tired gray. Deep and clean and correct, the shade that made the lines of the old truck make sense, that completed something. The chrome on the mirrors had been polished. The headlights were clear. The front end sat straight and true, both panels flush, the geometry right. It looked like a truck that had been taken care of. It looked like something someone valued. Mason was standing a few feet away, watching her look at it, with his arms crossed and the expression he wore when he wasn't sure yet whether something was right. It looks, she started. It's not done, he said. Engine needs another check before I run it regular, but, he paused. Close. She walked around the truck slowly. She looked at the driver's side door where the toe scrape had been. Gone, blended into the restored paint with a patience she could almost feel. She looked at the panel, the headlight housing. She stood at the back and looked at the proportions of it. It looks like itself, she said. Yeah, he said, and there was something in his voice, not relief exactly, but the release of a thing you've been holding without entirely knowing you were holding it. She looked at him. He was looking at the truck with the expression of someone who hasn't quite given himself permission to be satisfied yet, but is close to it. His jaw was set. His hands, holding his arms crossed, had relaxed slightly. Are you going to get in it? She asked. In a minute, he said. She understood that. Some things you waited for. They stood in the February cold for a moment, looking at the truck together, and the city did its usual business around them. A car passing on the street, the sound of something in the tire shop next door, the thin winter light doing its best with the afternoon. I owe Eleanor a visit, Mason said. She'd like that, Vanessa said. She asked about you at the HVAC day. I told her the truck was almost done. What'd she say? She said good, like it was obvious. Vanessa paused. Like of course it would be done. Like that was never in question. Mason looked at the truck. She's right, he said. Well, Noah came out of the shop at that point, through the side door that connected to the office, carrying 2 cans of soda he'd extracted from somewhere and distributing them with the authority of a child who has decided he's hosting. He handed one to Vanessa and one to his father and kept nothing for himself, which meant he'd already had one inside, which Mason registered and decided not to address. It looks good, Noah told the truck, as if speaking to it directly. Yeah, Mason said. Noah looked at Vanessa. My dad won't admit when something looks good until he's checked it 3 more times, he said confidingly. I know, Vanessa said. I've noticed that about him. Mason looked between the two of them. You're ganging up on me, he said. We're agreeing with each other, Noah said. That's different. Mason opened his soda. He looked at the truck, and then at his son, and then at the woman who had ordered his truck towed 4 months ago and was now standing in front of his shop in the February cold, holding a soda she hadn't asked for with the slightly uncertain ease of someone who was getting used to a new version of herself. And he thought about the word different and whether it was, in fact, different from ganging up, and decided that probably depended on who was asking. Go finish your homework, he told Noah. It's done, Noah said. Go check it. Noah took his soda and went back inside with the particular gait of someone who knows they've been outmaneuvered and is choosing to accept this gracefully. Vanessa was almost smiling. He's something, she said. He is, Mason said. He looked at the truck one more time, uncrossed his arms, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the keys. He held them for a moment, looked at Vanessa. You want to see if she starts? He said. It was a simple question. It was also, she understood, in the way she'd learned to understand the things he said simply, more than that. An offering of something, a small and specific one, the kind that costs something real precisely because it doesn't announce itself. Yeah, she said. I do. He walked to the driver's door and opened it. It swung clean now, no grinding, and got in. He put the key in the ignition and sat for a moment with his hand on it, not turning it yet. Vanessa stood outside near the front and watched through the windshield. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. A deep, even sound. Not the rattling complaint of October, not the metallic shudder on shutdown, but something steady and clear. The sound of an engine running the way it was supposed to run. He let it idle, listening to it, one hand still on the steering wheel and his eyes on the middle distance. He sat there for 30 seconds, just listening. Then he put it in park and shut it off and got out, and he stood beside the truck with his hand flat on the hood, feeling the warmth of the engine through the metal. Vanessa didn't say anything. She'd learned in the last few months that some moments weren't improved by words. Noah appeared in the bay door, having apparently decided that homework verification was complete. Did it start? He called. First try, Mason said. Noah pumped his fist once, which was exactly the right response, and Mason looked at the truck one more time with his hand still warm on the hood, and the February light came down thin and clear, and the city went about its business. And in the small space of a repair shop on a commercial strip in Decatur, something that had been broken for a long time was whole again. Not perfect, not brand new. Whole. March came in the way March always does in Atlanta. Uncertain, a little restless. The city not quite ready to commit to spring, but tired enough of winter to start leaning toward it. Some mornings were cold enough that you could still see your breath at 7 a.m. By afternoon, the sun would push through and the temperature would climb 15 degrees, and you'd be standing in your jacket wondering if you'd overdressed. It was the kind of weather that required you to make small decisions constantly, which Mason had always thought was either training or punishment depending on the day. He drove the Silverado to Eleanor Marsh's house on a Saturday morning in the first week of March. He'd called ahead, which Eleanor had told him was unnecessary. You don't need an appointment to visit, Mason. This isn't a dentist office. But he called anyway because that was how he was. He arrived at 10, parked in front of the house on Donnelly Avenue, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before getting out. The street looked the same as it had in October, when he'd driven here with the documents she'd given him. The same houses, the same oaks losing the last of their dead leaves, The same sense of a neighborhood that had been here long enough to have a settled permanence. Not frozen, not unchanged, but rooted. The demolition notices were gone from the doors. He could see at the end of the block the Heritage House with its windows lit from inside. And from here, even closed, he could imagine the new heating system running quietly inside it. The idea of that gave him a satisfaction that was out of proportion to his actual involvement in the HVAC installation. But he didn't examine that too closely. Eleanor met him at the door before he'd reached the porch steps. She looked at the truck first. She stood on the top step with her arms folded across her chest against the March chill, and she looked at the Silverado the way you look at something you've been told about but needed to see to believe. She looked at it for a long moment. The paint, the front end, the whole shape of it sitting straight and true in the morning light. "Well," she said. "Yeah," Mason said. "That's something," she said. "It is." She looked at him. "You did that yourself?" "Most of it. Marcus did the bodywork consultation. The paint was me." Eleanor shook her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the specific way of someone confirming a thing they already knew. "Come in," she said. "Coffee's ready. I made the pound cake." The kitchen was the same as he remembered. Warm, slightly overfull. The radio on low, papers and folders stacked on one end of the table with the organized intentionality of a person who processed the world through documentation. Eleanor poured coffee and cut 2 slices of cake, and they sat across from each other the way they'd sat in October, and for a moment Mason felt the strange quality of a loop closing, of returning to a starting point with different weight. "How are you?" Eleanor asked. Not as a formality. "Good," he said. "Busy. The shop is doing well. He's good. He's decided he wants to learn how engines work, which is either going to be genuinely useful or a phase that costs me money and supplies." Eleanor smiled. "Probably both." "Probably both," he agreed. They drank coffee. Eleanor asked about the East Side project. Not the legal details, which didn't interest her, but the real details. Whether the residents had been directly contacted, whether the survey corrections had actually been made, whether someone had personally walked Donnelly Avenue with the revised plans and explained what was changing and what wasn't. Mason told her what he knew, which was what Olivia had told him, and what Vanessa had told him, and what he'd read in the public planning documents he still, quietly, followed. Yes to all of it. The direct outreach had happened. Renata Garcia's team had done door-to-door consultations in November and December. The revised plans were on file with the city and publicly available. Eleanor listened to all of this with the careful attention of someone who has learned to distinguish between what's been promised and what's been done. "The Sterling woman," Eleanor said. "Vanessa." "Yeah," Mason said. "She comes to your shop." It wasn't a question. Eleanor knew things through mechanisms Mason had never fully understood. The network of a woman who had lived in the same place for 53 years and paid attention the whole time. "She does," Mason said. Eleanor looked at him. "She's trying," he said. "I know she's trying," Eleanor said. "I've met her. I'm asking about you." Mason was quiet for a moment. "I don't know exactly what you're asking," he said. "I think you do," Eleanor said. He looked at his coffee. Eleanor had the particular patience of someone who was willing to wait as long as necessary, which meant that trying to wait her out was essentially futile. "She's different than I thought she was," Mason said. "Or maybe she's becoming different. I'm not entirely sure which." "Does it matter which?" He thought about it. "Maybe not," he said. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. She ate a piece of pound cake. She looked at him with the directness that he'd learned over these months was her primary mode of communication. Not unkind, just straight. "You're allowed to let people in, Mason," she said. "That's not a betrayal of anything." He didn't say anything. "I knew Claire," Eleanor said quietly. "Not well. She came here once, with you, years ago, before Noah was born. You were looking at a car parked outside. She came inside and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular." She paused. "She was good. I could tell that in an hour." Mason's jaw was slightly tight. "She'd want you to be less lonely," Eleanor said. "That's not a radical insight. That's just what people who love each other want." He looked at the table. "I'm not asking you to decide anything," Eleanor said. "I'm just saying, don't Don't talk yourself out of something before it's had a chance to be anything. She paused. You drove 40 minutes in a rainstorm for me. You read 50 years of my papers. You're the most careful person I know with things worth keeping. Just make sure you're not being so careful that you keep your distance from something good. The radio played something low and old in the background. Outside, a car passed on Donnelly Avenue. The Heritage House sat at the end of the block, solid and warm. Mason looked up at Eleanor. You always this direct? He said. I'm 81, she said. I don't have time not to be. He thought about what Eleanor said on the drive home. He didn't arrive at any conclusions, which was typical. He processed things slowly, held them, turned them over. Noah was at a friend's house until 4 and the shop was closed on Saturdays, so Mason drove without a destination for a while, which he rarely let himself do. He drove past the East Side corridor. He hadn't done this deliberately, but he wasn't surprised when he found himself there. He drove slowly down the blocks that were scheduled for renovation, the industrial section at the north end of the corridor, which had already been cleared and was showing the first signs of groundwork preparation, orange construction fencing and surveying stakes, and the organized disruption that preceded building. Then down toward Donnelly Avenue, which was quiet on a Saturday morning, the residents going about their weekend lives, the block unmistakably a neighborhood and not a project site. He parked briefly and looked at the Heritage House. The new HVAC system was in there, running warm, and he thought about Eleanor's hand on the vent. About 30 people sitting in folding chairs in that room, watching Vanessa answer questions without flinching. About the way Thomas Reeves had nodded. Not warmly, not coldly, just accurately. The way you acknowledge a debt that's been settled to the extent it can be settled. Some things couldn't be fully repaid. He understood that better than most people. But the attempt mattered. The honest attempt, made without expectation of credit, made because it was owed, that mattered in ways that were harder to measure but more real. He drove home. But the following Thursday, Vanessa came by the shop later than usual, closer to 5 than 4, the light already going flat by the time she pulled in. Mason was finishing up a sedan that had been sitting in the bay since Tuesday, waiting on a part that had finally arrived that morning. She looked different. He noticed it immediately. Not dramatically different, not visibly changed in any way he could have pointed to specifically. But there was something slightly less braced about her. Something that had been held carefully for a long time and had been, recently, set down. Long week? He asked, not looking up from the sedan. Board approval came through today, she said. The full remediation plan. Everything. He looked up. The Community Investment Fund, the revised development timeline, the Heritage Preservation Protocol that applies to all future Sterling Horizon projects. All of it approved. It's done. It's actually done. He looked at her for a moment. How does that feel? He asked. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated because she'd learned not to give him the easy answer. Like when you finish a really long job, she said. You know it's done, but your body doesn't believe it yet. He understood that exactly. There's something else, she said. He waited. I went to see Kevin Park. He was quiet. Not on company business, she said. Just, I went to his apartment. I knocked on his door. I told him directly that what happened to him was wrong and that I was sorry it happened on my watch and that I should have built something that made it impossible for someone to do what Daniel did to him. She paused. He was surprised. I think he expected a formal letter from legal. What'd he say? He said thank you, and then he said... She stopped, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite pain. He said, I'm still glad I flagged it, even with everything. I'd do it again. She looked at Mason. He's 26 years old, and he got reassigned and made to feel like he'd made a mistake, and he'd still do it again. Yeah, Mason said, that's... She stopped. That's the kind of person you want in your building, Mason said. I offered him his position back, she said. Full reinstatement, back pay, different team, direct reporting line to Olivia. He asked for 2 days to think about it. Did he take it? He called yesterday. He said yes. A small pause. He also said he had some questions about the audit protocols on the other active projects and whether those could be reviewed. I said yes to that too. Mason looked at her for a moment, then he went back to the sedan. Good, he said. It's not enough, she said, for what happened to him. It doesn't undo 3 months of... No. Mason said. It doesn't. But you did what you could do, and you did it directly, and you didn't make him come to you for it. He looked up again. That's not nothing. She absorbed this. Eleanor told me something, Mason said, returning to the sedan. Last Saturday. She said the honest attempt mattered even when the result wasn't clean. He paused. She didn't say it exactly like that. She said it in Eleanor's way, which involves more directness and less hedging, but that was the substance. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. She told me something too, Vanessa said. At the resident meeting. She said you read all her papers, not just the relevant ones. I know, Mason said. You told me that before. I know I did, Vanessa said. I think about it a lot. She paused. I've been trying to figure out why it matters to me. And I think it's because most people would have skimmed for the important parts. Most people would have taken what they needed and left the rest. And you didn't. She paused again. That's how you treat everything, isn't it? You read the whole thing. Mason didn't answer right away. He tightened a bolt, checked the torque, moved to the next one. Some things deserve the full attention, he said finally. That's all. Spring moved in properly through March and into April, the way it does in Georgia. Tentatively at first, and then all at once, like the city had been waiting and then couldn't wait anymore. The trees on Donnelly Avenue put out new leaves. The construction on the north end of the East Side corridor proceeded on schedule, the skeletal framework of the first new building going up against the April sky. Mason drove the Silverado every day. It ran well. It ran better than well, He'd addressed things during the restoration that had been slowly degrading for years, small inefficiencies and wear patterns that he'd accepted because the truck worked and there was always something more urgent. Now it ran the way it had when Claire had driven it home from the dealership in 2003, 22 years old and newly in love with it, telling Mason she'd always wanted a blue truck and hadn't realized it until she saw this one. Noah had asked one morning in April when Mason was warming it up before school whether it felt different. Driving it, Noah said. Does it feel different now? Mason thought about it. It feels like it's supposed to feel, he said. Maybe that's different. Noah had considered this with the seriousness he brought to things that he sensed mattered. Mom would like that it's fixed, he said. Not would have liked. Would like. Present tense, which was how Noah had always talked about Claire, and not as someone fixed in the past, but as someone whose preferences and opinions were still available for reference, still relevant, still real. Mason had nodded. Yeah, he said, she would. They drove to school in the restored Silverado on a Tuesday morning in April, and Noah told him 3 separate facts about construction equipment that he'd apparently been accumulating, and Mason listened to all of them and asked questions, and the truck ran even and clean on the Decatur streets, carrying them forward. The East Side corridor held a community groundbreaking ceremony in April. It was Renata Garcia's idea, and Vanessa had agreed to it immediately. Not the standard corporate groundbreaking with a ribbon and a few remarks and photographs for the press release. Renata had been very clear about what she thought of that format, but something actual. An afternoon event in the main hall of the Heritage House, open to anyone, with a presentation of the revised plans that was genuinely explanatory rather than promotional, and time for questions, and food that Eleanor Marsh had organized because Eleanor had opinions about what constituted adequate catering and was not shy about expressing them. About 60 people came. Thomas Reeves was there, Kevin Park was there, which surprised Mason slightly when he saw him, but made sense. He was part of the East Side team now, under Olivia, and he had more reason to be at this table than almost anyone. Eleanor was there in a chair near the front that someone had placed specifically for her, and she held herself with the particular authority of someone who has been through the fire and is still here to see the outcome. Mason came with Noah. They arrived a few minutes late because Noah had lost one of his shoes, not in the conventional sense of not knowing where his shoes were, but in the more specific sense of having put one shoe outside the back door for a reason he was unable to immediately articulate and then forgetting about it. And the resulting logistical delay had pushed them past the start time. They slipped into the back of the room while Renata was presenting the plans on a large screen at the front. Vanessa was near the front of the room, seated rather than standing, which Mason noted. She'd learned in these months that rooms like this weren't improved by the CEO standing at the front. She was there as a participant, not a presenter. Renata was the presenter. Renata, who was difficult and worth it, who had spent 11 weeks building something genuinely better. Noah looked at the presentation with real interest. He was at the age where large construction projects were legitimately exciting, and the East Side Corridor plans, the buildings, the community spaces, the street-level design, were visually compelling enough that he leaned slightly forward in his chair, studying them. "Is that going to be real?" he whispered to Mason. "That's the plan," Mason said. "And the Heritage House stays?" "The Heritage House stays." Noah looked at the screen. "That's good," he said, with the simple finality of a 10-year-old who has assessed a situation and arrived at a verdict. During the question period, Thomas Reeves asked a pointed question about the demolition timeline for the industrial section and whether any of the displaced commercial tenants had been offered space in the new development. Renata answered it directly, including the parts that weren't fully resolved yet, which Thomas acknowledged with a nod that was slightly warmer than the one he'd given Vanessa in February. Incremental, but real. An older man in the back asked about parking, which caused a 5-minute detour into the specifics of the Northern Block streetscape design, which Renata navigated with impressive patience. A young woman Mason didn't recognize asked about community hiring targets for the construction phase, and Kevin Park, from the side of the room, answered before Renata had a chance to, quickly, clearly, with specific numbers. And Vanessa looked at him from across the room with an expression that was something close to quiet satisfaction. After the formal part ended and people moved to food and conversation, Eleanor found Mason near the back. She looked at Noah first. "This is your boy," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd been told. "Eleanor, this is Noah," Mason said. Noah, who had been briefed on Eleanor's role in the whole story, looked at her with the particular solemnity of a child meeting someone who matters. He held out his hand to shake, which he'd decided to do on his own, and Eleanor shook it seriously. "I hear you've been helping restore that truck," Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am," Noah said. "Mostly I hand things and hold the flashlight." "That's a real contribution," Eleanor said seriously. Noah straightened slightly. Eleanor looked at Mason. "Good-looking boy," she said. "He has his moments," Mason said. "I can hear you," Noah said. Eleanor smiled, genuinely, openly, the kind of smile that arrived on her face rarely enough that you noticed it when it did. She patted Noah's shoulder and moved toward the food table, and Mason watched her go with the particular feeling of gratitude that doesn't announce itself but settles in quietly, the way warmth does. Vanessa found him near the window 20 minutes later, holding a plate of food he'd been eating slowly while Noah had attached himself to the display of architectural models on the far side of the room and was interrogating Renata Garcia about the structural engineering with a focus that Renata, to her credit, appeared to find more interesting than annoying. "He's going to end up in construction," Vanessa said. "He's going to end up in whatever he ends up in," Mason said. "Right now I'm just trying to make sure he has a vocabulary for it." She stood beside him at the window looking at the room. It was a good room, full of people who had a reason to be there, talking about something real, in a building that had been 7 weeks away from a demolition notice in October, and was now, by all available evidence, going to stand for another 60 years. "I want to tell you something," Vanessa said. She said it with the directness she'd developed, not performed, just real. She'd stopped managing her words with him sometime in January, and neither of them had acknowledged it, but both of them had noticed. He looked at her. "When I looked out the window in October and saw your truck," she said, "I made a decision about what I was looking at in about 5 seconds. And I was wrong about every part of it." She paused. "I've been thinking about why, and I don't think it was just arrogance, though it was that too. I think I'd been moving so fast for so long that I'd stopped being curious. Curious about specifics. Curious about what was actually in front of me instead of what I'd already categorized." She paused. "You can run a company like that. You can build things like that. But you can't. You can't actually see anything." Mason was quiet. "I'm not saying I fixed that," she said. "I'm saying I know it's the thing, the real thing. And I didn't know it was the thing until you." He held her gaze for a moment. "You would have figured it out eventually," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but not before those houses came down. Not before the Heritage House was rubble." She shook her head slightly. "Don't let me off easy. I'm not letting you off easy, he said. I'm saying you're capable of learning. That's different. She looked at him. Eleanor said something like that to me, she said, in almost those exact words. Eleanor's usually right, he said. She really is, Vanessa said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I looked up Gerald. He frowned slightly. What? Eleanor told me the truck had a name. I asked her what it was, and she said Gerald. She paused. I looked up whether there's a meaning. Apparently it means rules by the spear, which is either very wrong or somehow exactly right for an old truck. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a polite laugh or a social laugh. It came from somewhere real, the kind of laugh that arrives before you've decided to let it. And it lasted long enough that Noah looked over from across the room with an expression of pure curiosity. Vanessa was smiling, and the smile was not composed or professional. It was just a smile, the kind that happens when something is genuinely funny and you're genuinely there for it. Rules by the spear, Mason said. That's what it said, she said. He shook his head. Claire named him. She'd have loved that. I thought she might, Vanessa said quietly. He looked at her. There was a beat that was not awkward. Something had shifted in the room, or in him, or in the space between them, something that Eleanor had anticipated and that Mason had been carefully not looking at for 2 months. He was looking at it now. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. There's a place in Decatur, he said. It's not fancy. They have good coffee, and they do breakfast until 2 in the afternoon, and the parking is bad, but it's worth it. He paused. I was thinking about going Sunday, with Noah. Eleanor too, probably, if she wants to. He paused. I thought you might want to come. She held his gaze. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic overture delivered with polish. It was an invitation to breakfast at a place with bad parking, from a man who had learned, through the hardest years of his life, to offer things plainly because plain was what he meant. She understood this. She'd learned to read him well enough to understand that this was the real thing being offered simply, which was always how he did it. Yeah, she said. I'd like that. They went on Sunday. The place was called Mornings, which was either a poetic name or a functional one, depending on how you looked at it, and it sat on a side street in Decatur with outdoor seating that was technically open but still cold enough in early April that they moved inside. The booths were vinyl and slightly cracked. The coffee was excellent. The menu was hand-lettered on a chalkboard in handwriting that suggested the person responsible had strong opinions about breakfast and modest confidence in their penmanship. Eleanor came. She arrived in a coat and hat, walked through the door, assessed the room, and chose the booth by the window without consulting anyone, which established the seating arrangement definitively. Noah slid in beside Eleanor, which surprised Mason slightly, but Eleanor accepted this without comment and spent the next 20 minutes discussing, very seriously, which combination of menu items constituted the optimal breakfast. Noah had opinions. Eleanor had more refined ones. They reached a consensus that involved eggs, biscuits, and something Eleanor called the correct amount of coffee, which she established as different for each person and was not negotiable. Vanessa sat across from Mason. She ordered black coffee, which the waiter brought in a ceramic mug that had been used enough to have earned its character. She wrapped both hands around it, which she always did. He'd noticed that about her, the way she held hot things with both hands like she was keeping them close. The morning came through the window at the angle that April mornings do, low and slightly gold, the particular light that doesn't last long but is real while it's there. They talked about nothing especially important. Eleanor told a story about the Heritage House's original furnace that was either horrifying or hilarious, depending on your relationship to heating systems, and which landed with the assembled table as both simultaneously. Noah told a long story about a situation at school that involved a misunderstanding about a science project and a papier-mâché volcano that had been more structurally ambitious than advisable. Mason listened and contributed where needed and watched his son talk, the way he always watched Noah talk, with the attentiveness of a parent who is trying to memorize things while they're still happening. Vanessa watched too. Not obviously, not in a way that called attention to itself. She watched Noah the way you watch something that you find genuinely interesting without an agenda for it. At some point, Noah said, to no one in particular, "This is a good breakfast." "Best decision you've made all year," Eleanor told him. I thought the truck looked really good, Noah said. Second best, Eleanor said. Noah thought about this. What's first? Eleanor looked at him with the expression of someone who has decided a 10-year-old is capable of the honest answer. Showing up, she said. That's always first. Noah nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when something landed deeper than he could immediately process. He'd think about it later, Mason knew. That was how his son worked. Things went in and came out days later, recontextualized, part of some ongoing internal conversation. Mason looked across the table at Vanessa. She was looking at him, not performing anything, not managing an impression, just looking, the way people look at each other when they've stopped pretending to look at other things. He thought about October. The rain, the parking lot, the sound of his truck being loaded onto a tow bed while he stood on the asphalt with a folder full of documents and a bad feeling about how the morning was going. He thought about Eleanor's kitchen table and 50 years of papers, and a woman who had kept careful records of things that deserved to be remembered. He thought about a conference room on the 29th floor and Daniel Cross's hand moving slightly on the table. He thought about a green notebook in a glove compartment and an engine turning over on the first try in February light and a 10-year-old pumping his fist at the door of a bay. He thought about what got carried, not the damage. The damage could be repaired. The paint could be matched. The frame could be aligned. The panel could be replaced. Those things, with enough patience and the right tools and the willingness to do the work slowly, could be made right. What got carried was the rest of it. The 53 years of Eleanor's careful record-keeping, Noah's present-tense relationship with a mother he'd had for 6 years and would carry in some form for the rest of his life. The green notebook full of handwriting that still had texture when you ran your finger over the letters. The things that couldn't be restored but could be tended, kept close, allowed to remain real. And the people, maybe. The unexpected ones who arrived in your life sideways, through circumstances you didn't choose, and turned out to contain more than you'd assumed on first look. He looked at Vanessa across a breakfast table in a small restaurant in Decatur, with bad parking and excellent coffee, and he thought about how he'd seen her in that conference room for the first time. The composed precision of her, the blazer, the practiced stillness. And how that was real but not complete, not even close to complete, because people rarely were. He'd learned that from Claire and from Noah and from Eleanor, and from the years of working on things with his hands, that nothing real was only its surface, that the surface was where you started, not where you stopped. Vanessa had started somewhere wrong and moved, with real effort and without being asked, toward somewhere better. That wasn't nothing. In his experience, it was actually quite rare. She caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She studied him for a moment with the directness she'd never unlearned, the quality that had been hard and capable when he first encountered it and had become, through the winter months, something more textured. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you're thinking something and deciding whether to say it." He looked at her. "Rules by the spear," he said. She blinked. Then she laughed. The real laugh. The one that arrived before she could compose it, and it was the same as it had been in October. Unexpected and entirely her, the clearest thing he'd heard all morning. Eleanor, across the table, looked at the two of them with an expression of complete unsurprise. Noah looked between them with the specific confusion of a 10-year-old who has missed the reference. "What does that mean?" Noah said. "Ask me later," Mason said. "You always say that." "Because later is usually better," Mason said. Noah looked at Eleanor for adjudication. Eleanor shook her head slightly, signaling that this was above her jurisdiction, and returned to her coffee with the dignity of someone who knows when to stay out of it. Outside on the side street in Decatur, the April morning was doing its best work. Warm enough to mean it now, the light clear and moving, the city going about its weekend in the ordinary way of a city that doesn't know it's the backdrop for anything in particular and doesn't need to. Inside, a small breakfast went on a little longer. Plates were refilled. Noah eventually got the story about Gerald's name, and thought about it very seriously, and declared it correct. Eleanor ordered a second coffee, and did not consider this excessive. Vanessa asked Mason something about the new transmission job he'd been thinking through all week, and he explained it, and she followed it with the focused attention she brought to everything now. And they talked through it in the ordinary way of two people who have learned that the other one's attention is worth having. The morning held. Some things didn't make the news. Some things didn't resolve in court or in board meetings, or in the clean narratives that got written down somewhere. Some things resolved in a breakfast booth, in a restored truck running clean on Decatur streets, in the warm air of a community center that had survived the winter and would survive the next one too, in a 10-year-old's hand on a flashlight in a repair bay, in an old woman with 50 years of careful papers and the patience to wait for someone to read them, in what people chose to carry and how carefully and who they let walk alongside. Mason paid the check. Eleanor argued about this and lost, which he suspected she'd allowed. Vanessa left the tip, and when he noticed she'd left more than she needed to, she said very simply, "The coffee was worth it," and he couldn't disagree with that. They walked out into the April morning together, Mason and Noah and Eleanor and Vanessa, in a loose grouping that was not yet a shape with a name, but was, undeniably, something, and the street held them for a moment in the light, and then they moved through it, each in their own direction, and the morning went on. The Silverado was parked half a block up. Mason unlocked it as they reached it. He held the door for Eleanor, who accepted this without comment and settled in the passenger seat with the comfortable authority of someone who has been given the correct seat. Noah climbed in back. Mason went around to the driver's side. Vanessa stood at the curb. "Sunday," Mason said. Not a question. "Sunday," she said. And then, after a moment, "Same place?" "Same place," he said. She nodded once, the clean, direct way she acknowledged things, and walked to her car. He watched her go for a moment, then got in. He put the key in. Engine caught first try, the same as it had in February, the same as it would tomorrow and the day after that, running the way it was supposed to run, carrying what it was supposed to carry. "Dad," Noah said from the back seat. "Yeah." "Is she going to come to more breakfasts?" Mason looked at the rearview mirror. Noah was watching him with the careful attention of a child who already knows the answer and is checking whether his father is going to be honest about it. "Yeah," Mason said. "I think so." Noah considered this. "Good," he said. "She's funny when she laughs." Mason pulled out onto the street. The city moved around them in the April light, building and tearing down and building again, the permanent restless motion of a place that has never quite decided to stop becoming. The Heritage House was 3 blocks east, warm and solid. Donnelly Avenue was going about its Saturday. Eleanor was reading something she'd pulled from her purse already, glasses on, entirely self-sufficient. Noah was watching the city go by with the focused interest he brought to everything that moved, and the truck ran clean and even through it all, carrying them forward, the same way it had carried everything it had ever been given to carry. Not perfectly, not without wear, but faithfully. The way things do when they've been made right. When someone took the time.